Archana, we should start now. It is online. It has been connected with YouTube. Yeah, you please start.
Okay. So sorry for the inconvenience and good afternoon to all of you once again. I, on behalf of Department of Philosophy, Ramanujan College, welcome you all on the day 4 of the 1 week online faculty development program on philosophical methodologies in higher education, research, and teaching. So today our speakers are Dr. Nilanjan Bhomik and Vikram Singh Sarola. So, Professor Bala Ganapati will be kind of chair for the session. And I request Nidhi ma'am to give an introduction of our first speaker. So, I time is open. I give time to Dr. Nidhi ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Archana Jamatia, ma'am. I welcome the respected resource person for today, Professor Nilanjan Bhaumik, Professor Bala Ganapati, Program Director, Dr. Zairunisha, Program Convener, all the other colleagues, and the wonderful participants who have been with us on this wonderful journey of this 1 week online faculty development program on philosophical methodologies, research, and training. So, like I said, we have with us Professor Nilanjan Bhaumik, and Sir will be conducting a session on method and methodology. Professor Bhaumik teaches philosophy at the Department of Philosophy, University of Delhi. His areas of interest includes philosophy of language, philosophy of logic. He has a specialization in linguistic and philosophy. He teaches philosophy of science, Greek philosophy, and philosophy of language. We welcome you, sir. I now request you to take over the session. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Nidhi. Thank you very much. I hope people can hear me because my microphone and speaker are always
Yes, sir. You are completely audible and visible to us. Yes.
Okay.
Go
I
ahead.
don't know how much visibility helps in understanding, but audibility will help in understanding.
Yeah.
But okay, so the talk is titled as Method and Methodology. Now, this is a very provocative title to give because any such thing. I'm going to beat about the bush for a while and hopefully I will get to say something useful about method and methodology. That's not going to be easy at all because I know very little about method and methodology. So someone once asked me to give a lecture on research methodology. So I said, I know nothing about research methodology. I mean, I understand that you are supposed to be curious about some topic and you do some research on it. But then I'm not aware that there is anything called research methodology, unless you mean putting in citations or bibliography, but that's not methodology of any kind. I mean, that's a kind of practice people do, and that's all there is to it. So one can't call that methodology. But I actually did go to the library once, the Central Reference Library, and I checked there is a section there. It's called methodology section or something like that. And it had some really frightening books in it. So none of the books were such that I could have read them. They were books on statistics and they were all called research methodology or something like that. And there are quite a number of books, something like 300 or 400 of them. And I was really quite shocked and astonished to believe that there was so much work on research methodology and I knew nothing about it at all. So it seems as if I'm profoundly and completely ignorant about research methodology. But yet I'm giving a talk on method and methodology. But I think I may have something interesting to say about it. But let me start first by saying that I have never been very sure of what these words mean and how they are to be used in philosophy. They may have more concrete uses in other subjects like history, for instance, and sociology, for instance. Sociologists have to know a fair amount of statistics, that is. And economics, of course, you have to know a fair amount of mathematics and statistics. Statistics is a subject in which essentially there are lots of methods that are being used. Whether they have a methodology is a different question, but they certainly have lots and lots and lots of methods to analyze the same data. So you give them lots of data and they will do standard deviation and mean and median and all kinds of things, I mean, binomial distributions and whatever else, hundreds and hundreds of statistical methods are there to analyze the same data, and they will tell you whether the data is good or bad or whatever. But we don't have that kind of richness in philosophy. So what do we mean by methodology in philosophy? So, well, that's not that easy a question to answer. But so one way you would, if you are confused about what methodology means in philosophy, you could just check some books. For instance, you can look at a book by, there's a book titled Armchair or Laboratory. That's a very interesting title. It says that should you do philosophy sitting in your armchair, or should you do it by going to the laboratory? Lots of people believe you should go to the laboratory because they're influenced by science and mathematics and things like that. So you should go to the laboratory and you start doing experiments and whatever. And lots of people do experimental philosophy nowadays. I think there was even a special issue in Journal of Indian Council of Philosophical Research on experimental philosophy. So it's picking up in India as well. So whether experimental philosophy is the right thing to do is another issue. Lots of people are very skeptical about it. So Capellan in Norway, for instance, was a very good philosopher. He's very skeptical about it. But it is a trend. And so basically you make, they do use some statistics, and they also give all kinds of questionnaires to people as to what they believe and what they don't believe and whether they believe in reason or things like that. And sometimes very interesting and complex results come out of these questionnaires and from experimental philosophy. It has led to quite an interesting situation in the subject. The other thing is that you sit in your armchair and do philosophy. This is how Plato did it. And, he used to just write. But by the way, Plato didn't write on paper. He used to write on what is called wax. Now, I'm not sure what they mean by wax, but he used to have a steel nib with him and he used to write on wax. Now, I don't know how you can do such a thing, but I presume he did it very well indeed. And of course, Aristotle possibly wrote on parchments. That's possible, but I'm not very sure about this. But we know that Plato wrote on wax. So Plato used to just sit in his chair and he used to write on wax. And that's just armchair activity, right? Or at best, you are arguing with somebody else. So somebody is sitting in front of you and you are arguing with him. Sometimes in France, maybe it is very popular to say that you are sitting in a coffee shop and you're arguing with some famous philosopher. So maybe you can find Jean-Paul Sartre sitting there and arguing with somebody else on some issue. So that's armchair activity. By the way, a lot of economics, say theoretical economics, like Keynesian economics, that's basically armchair activity. You sit in your house, you work out a theory, which is mathematically very good, and you write it out. Of course, even mathematics is an entirely armchair activity. There are no experiments in mathematics. I remember, I think Michael Dummett saying somewhere that mathematics is not a science because it does not involve any laboratory. There is no experiment there. So how can it be a science? But anyway, of course, even if mathematics is not a science, that doesn't mean that it doesn't prove anything. Mathematics is involved very deeply in proof. And so it doesn't really get affected if there are no laboratories in it. So this still leaves us with the question, what are we to mean by philosophical methodology, and what does methodology mean in the subject? What do we mean when we say that there are various methods in philosophy? So you can try the book Armchair or Laboratory. There's also a Cambridge Companion to Philosophical Methodology, which is an interesting book. I have heard a lot about conceptual analysis in the various talks I heard in the faculty development program. So, and I will have something to say about it as I go on. So you can check these books. There's also another book. I think it's a fat one by, I think it's published by Macmillan or something. It's a pretty interesting book and it is called Philosophical Methodologies. And there they mostly concentrate on what is called a thought experiment. And I will come back to thought experiments as I go on. So you can check these books, and they're very interesting books. Anyone can read them. So especially those who are in political science, they can read these books. There's very interesting thought in them about how one is supposed to establish political thoughts in political science, for instance. So political science is very close to philosophy as a subject. So you can read all these books and see what methodology means in them. But I haven't got any clearer ideas about methodology just from reading these books. It's not that easy to figure out what's going on in them. So what can we possibly mean by method in philosophy, and what can we possibly mean by methodology in philosophy? Now, if you look at philosophy as a subject, what is it that they are studying? Your method, whatever you do, it doesn't matter what you are doing, your method is affected by what your object of study is. So if your object of study is to buy a car, now you're not going to do statistical sampling and all kinds of things. Well, you will ask people, you will read advertisements, you will talk to various people. So somebody is asking for the names of the books to be repeated. I might come back to the names of the books again. So okay, so if you want to buy a car, for instance, you won't get into all kinds of standard deviation and this and that and philosophical methodology and whatever. No, you will just what you're going to do is you're going to look at advertisements, and you will speak to your friends, and you will look at which is the best car. Is it Honda or Maruti or whatever? And you will go by some opinion regarding these things. You will probably not look at global warming, as a matter of fact, which you should be looking at. So, but anyway, most people will not look into that because that may not be considered relevant in buying a car. It is the most relevant factor, but people may not consider that relevant. And you will also look at whether the car is compliant with all the laws and everything. That's what you will be looking at. So the method you adopt to do anything is decided by the object of your study. And so the issue is very simple in philosophy or in any subject. What are you going to do? What is the object of your study? What is the object of, let us say, studying Roman history? Well, it is Roman history. How do you study Roman history? Well, there are lots of books. But suppose you want to push yourself a little bit. Well, you can do archaeology. You can go to Rome or wherever else and do archaeology. Or maybe you want to study their aqueduct system as to how did they lay them out. Or you want to study their administrative system. Then you will have to look at various books and articles. And you do all kinds of things. And you might even get a hands-on experience by going somewhere. So that's how you do it. So the object of the study decides the method of the study. That's a very important aspect of methodology. It cannot be that I have a method which is completely blind. So I'm doing something which has nothing to do with the object at all. That can't be the case. It must be the case that I have an object in mind. And then I come to the method. I'm not saying that's going to make it my job easier in finding a method. No, not at all, actually. But at least I will have a start then. So what is the object of study in philosophy? I'm not saying that the answer in any other subject is any clearer, by the way. I didn't mean that. So the answer in political science, for instance, is certainly not clear. What is the object of study in political science? Well, there may be many objects of study. So they want to study justice. They want to study what is a state, how should a state function, what is the role of the people in the state. Very complex issues, and none of them are easy to answer at all. And so what method I should adopt is not going to be easy to figure out. But, or you take geography, for instance. Well, I mean, it's not at all easy. You have an object there, it's pretty clear. But there are very complex issues as to how do you figure out the height of a mountain, for instance. Not easy to do at all. It takes a fair amount of technology to do that. Or history, for instance, again, a subject that is tremendously complex. You have to know languages and all kinds of things. And then you have to start doing research, and you need to have a proper research question in history that has to be interesting as well. So there are many different opinions as to how the Mughal Empire collapsed, for instance. There are many opinions about it. And when the collapse started, some people think Shah Jahan led to the collapse of the empire. Some people think it started with Aurangzeb. Some people think it started after Aurangzeb. Some people think there is nothing to do with these fellows, but something to do with the people in the administration, and so on and so forth. There are different opinions, and there are different ways in which you do research to establish these things. So my first statement is that you need to have an object first, and then you figure out what is your method. So in the methodology, you don't first start with the method and then you go to the object. In my opinion, this is what most philosophers do. They already have an object in mind. Now in philosophy, as you remember, and you would know, you have questions that are actually questions that are meta questions. So in philosophy, you don't ask the question, who won the lawn tennis competition or Wimbledon competition in 1998? This is not a question you ask in philosophy. You may ask this in some general knowledge or whatever, but not in philosophy. You don't ask the question whether planets go around in ellipses around the sun, or do they go around in circles around the sun. This is not a question you ask in philosophy. So what do you ask in philosophy? Well, you ask, what is knowledge? Well, that's a very strange question. What do you mean, what is knowledge? We already have a lot of knowledge. Lots of human beings have knowledge. I mean, surely we are all running around with knowledge. So when you ask the question, what is knowledge? This creates a straightforward problem. How do you answer such a question? And so there are various, now the object, you may also ask the question, what is being, for instance? But then you see being all around you. There are people and dogs and trees and planets and whatever. All this is being. So what is it that the philosopher is confused with? He's asking, what is being? Or you ask the question, what is existence? That's a strange question to ask. All of us are existing. So what do you mean by asking what is existence? Well, you can have, the question is interesting because we talk a lot about Sherlock Holmes and his properties and whatever, but he doesn't exist. Or does he exist? I'm not sure, but maybe he does exist. But we ask these rather unusual meta questions. So if your object of study is a meta question, like knowledge about like existence, like being, like freedom, for instance, or like the will, for instance, or even like what is justice, that's a philosophical question as much as it is a political science question, or even the question, what is history? There is a lot of work on what history itself is. So, because people are confused about what's happening in the past and what is the past essentially, how is it related to the present? We are all creatures of the who are made by the past, but to what extent are we also independent of the past? So all these questions come in. So the object of study in philosophy is a very meta kind of object. And so the question arises, what are you supposed to do to study a question like this? It seems as if I have suddenly become presuppositionless. There is absolutely no presupposition I can have. So if you don't have any presuppositions at all, if you're asking the question, what is knowledge? Then really all other knowledge has come into question. So you really can't start from knowledge and get to knowledge. You must have some way of figuring. It seems as if philosophy cannot even be done. This was actually pointed out by Meno to Socrates. Meno told Socrates that if you don't accept any example, if you don't accept anything as an instance of virtue, you don't accept an example of virtue, you don't accept anything at all, then how on earth are you supposed to inquire? How is philosophical inquiry supposed to take place? This was a question raised about the methodology of philosophy backed by Plato. How do you do philosophy? Is it even possible to do this? If you are asking a meta question like what is virtue and you are not ready to accept any example of virtue, any instance of virtue, you are not ready to accept any definition I offer, then what are you supposed to do? How will you get to knowledge? So if you are asking the question what is history, then you can't read history books anymore. If you are asking the question what is geography, even after we have told you everything about geographical facts, that's not a meaningless question to ask. That is still a sensible question to ask. And so then you can't be studying more geography to answer that question. So clearly, when we are doing philosophy, we must be engaged not with the object in the world. Well, I'll come back to the issue as to why we are engaged with the object in the world, but we must be engaging in something else. Now, lots of people say that philosophy is conceptual analysis or it is engaging with concepts. Now, I don't think this is right. And I have never really understood from where this idea has come. I think it comes from some misapprehension regarding analytic philosophy as it was practiced early on, say 1920s, 30s. So I think people used to say philosophy is conceptual analysis. There are many articles also which say this, philosophy is conceptual analysis and all that. But I don't think this is entirely right because we are not studying concepts. We are studying very significant aspects of things that have been brought to our attention by reality. In reality, well, reality is real. Reality exists. There is knowledge in which everybody is participating in. There is belief. There is power and justice and free will and whatever. And so we see all this phenomena and we want to ask the question, what are these things? So partly philosophy is asking a question about the concept, but it is also asking a question about the object. So philosophy is not entirely conceptual analysis. Assuming, of course, that concepts exist. I mean, lots of people think that concepts don't even exist. So, and I'm one of them actually. I don't really think that even if concepts existed, they wouldn't be really very interesting objects, frankly speaking. But it would be a real mess actually if you really look into concepts. But philosophers are interested in these meta questions. And so if you're interested in meta questions, it is not incorrect to say you're studying concepts or you're doing conceptual analysis. No, but it is incorrect to think that this is all that philosophers do. There's probably no example of conceptual analysis I know of, but many people, you can also take a look at David Papineau's article. There is an article where he says that conceptual analysis is just not done. I mean, it's not something we can really do. And frankly speaking, what is the result of conceptual analysis if it was ever done? I don't think it has ever been done. But what is the result of conceptual analysis? The result is nothing. We have arrived at the situation where we now realize that no concept can be analyzed. So if concepts exist in the first place. So this can lead to the situation that we should probably give up conceptual analysis as it has been given up for quite some time now, I think from 1980s onwards or so. This whole idea of conceptual analysis just disappeared in the subject. But anyway, so my idea was this, that your method of study is decided by the object of study. In philosophy, we study we study meta questions. As I think most professors who are there in the FDB program actually study, they study meta questions. Some of them are involved in empirical studies, but many of them are probably in meta question at the meta question level. So when you are studying a meta question, what exactly is your going to be your method? One of the things that I've noticed about philosophy, if you actually look at what philosophers do, is that they already have a view about what the object is. So when they ask the question, what is knowledge? They already know what knowledge is to some extent. They have a view about it. So some people might think knowledge is just something empirical, and that is all there is to it. Or Plato just thought knowledge was something that was of something which is permanent, such that you can never really know that there is knowledge of the world. So you might think you know that you are watching something on Zoom, but Plato will say, no, you do not know this. It is simply a true belief, or maybe it's just even an opinion or something. So philosophers often have an opinion of what object they are studying. So Parmenides already has an opinion about being as such. He already has an opinion. So Shankaracharya already has an opinion of of Brahman. It's not that he first starts with ignorance, then he comes to an opinion of Brahman. It's not like that at all. He already has an opinion of Brahman, which he sharpens. That's what he's doing. So it's the same thing in economics or anywhere else. John Maynard Keynes already has a very strong opinion about how a state can improve or develop. And so he puts that opinion into a more mathematical form in his book, General Theory of Interest, Employment and Money, if that's what the book is called. I'm forgetting now. But he already has a strong opinion about what he's studying. So this is what philosophers do. You are not going to have a method unless you already have a strong opinion about what you're studying. So some people are skeptics. They say there is no such thing as knowledge. All right, that's fine. Well, what method do they have now? They really have no other method except to argue by continuously defeating other people's arguments. So that will be their method. It will be a method in which they will simply have you give them some argument, and then they will show by various contradictions and all kinds of problems that you are going to get into, that they will show that there is so much confusion that it is better to say that we don't know anything. So why do they do this? They do this because they're already convinced that you do not know anything. It is not that they employed a method and then they came to the conviction. They're already convinced, and then they come to the method, essentially. So you take Dinag, who is a very famous philosopher, very, very famous. And I mean, I consider Dinag to be a very, very good philosopher, outstanding. Now, Dinag doesn't need to be convinced about Buddhism, whatever Buddhism he may have believed in. Maybe he believed in some system, but he doesn't have to be convinced about it by argument. He is not writing arguments to convince himself of Buddhism. He already is convinced of it. Now he is employing a method such that the intellectual aspects of Buddhism become clearer, not just to himself, but to others. And of course, he faces problems, but that's all right. Everyone faces problems. So he tries to build an intellectual roadmap such that the Buddhist views are then supported by this intellectual roadmap. But he doesn't need that roadmap himself to believe in that particular specific theory of Buddhism. Maybe it helps him to believe more. So his degree of belief might improve. I doubt it very much, but that's quite possible that the degree of belief might improve. But it is not that he had no belief in Buddhism and then he argued and argued and argued and he came to the position of Buddhism. I don't think that is the case. So you look, I mean, I will give you a very live example. So we heard Professor Raghuram Raju yesterday. He said that I do not want to do Indian philosophy. I do not want to do Western philosophy. What I want to do is I want to use Western philosophy and see how it can be brought into the Indian context. And so he will bend the Western philosophy and he will bring it into Indian context. Okay. But notice that he already has a perspective. It is not that he is looking for some perspective. No, it is not that he has a method and then he looks for the perspective. No, he already has a perspective. Then he employs the method. Whatever method that may be, it may be some critical analysis of Deleuze and Guattari or whatever, that doesn't matter what it is. But the issue is you must have a perspective. I think this is very important for all academics to know that I can't first start with a method. So some people think that Hume started with a method like, oh, there are impressions and ideas, now what do I do? But that's not correct. Hume is already an empiricist. He is putting a structure into his empiricism. And then he employs the method. But it is not that he first starts with the question, should I believe in reason or should I believe in experience? That's not what he is doing. He makes the decision right on the first page of his book. He says, I am an empiricist, end of story. Now listen to me regarding what I can do with empiricism, which is not much, by the way. But well, Hume is not apologetic about it. He says that it is true. We can't do much with it, but we must live with this because we have nothing beyond our sense experience. If you don't accept it, okay, you're not a rational person then, because Hume thinks that reason must be determined by by something. So ultimately, it has to be determined by verification, maybe. But that's what he is already convinced of the object of his study. He knows that what he needs to do is to establish what is it that I can know by empirical means, because there is really nothing else to know. Hume is already convinced that if you cannot determine anything by mathematics and you cannot determine anything by sense experience, that the remaining thing that is there, which is not mathematical and which is not it doesn't come to you by sense experience, you throw it into the fire. He is already convinced by this. It is not that he arrives at this position. No, he already has this perspective, and then he starts his inquiry. So in the Upanishads, it is not that they are starting with ignorance and they get to knowledge. They already have a feeling that there is something called Brahman. Now, I'm not saying they already know what Brahman is, but they already have some feeling like this. And they slowly sharpen and express themselves through various different means to arrive at some better idea of Brahman. So in philosophy, this is one of those issues that we start from some vague notion and then we arrive at a better idea of it, not a completely true idea of it. That's probably very difficult to do. And Plato thought it was almost impossible to do. So since I mentioned Plato, I should say that Plato himself is convinced of the theory of forms. If he is convinced by it, it's very difficult to put any opinion on Plato because he keeps shifting and changing and he goes from one position to another. It is very difficult to say what he really believes. But we often say that he believes in the theory of forms. Well, all right, that's very nice. But he doesn't believe in the theory of forms because he had some antecedent argument. He already believes in the theory of forms and then he constructs various arguments. So Socrates already believes, even though he never wrote anything, but it is perfectly obvious to us that Socrates already believes that unless you have a definition, you can never come to know anything. Now, is he right about this? Well, that's another issue. But he already believes this. Now, once he believes this, he goes on with his elencus and his dialectic and whatever. So he employs various methods. So the method will always flow only when your object of study is clear. And there is another condition to this. So firstly, your object of study has to be clear. Secondly, you must have a perspective on that object of study. So let us say political science. Now your object of study might be how is the state related to the people, and you must have a perspective on that object of study. That is, I am a liberal. I may be a liberal. So, however, liberalism is not easy to defend. On the contrary, it is quite difficult to defend. So then your method will be, how do I defend liberalism? What can I possibly do to defend it, given the situation and all this, and lots of people who argue against liberalism. So how do I defend it? So firstly, you need to be yourself convinced in some intuitive way, maybe, of liberalism. And once you are convinced of it, then you construct arguments in favor of it. Just like John Maynard Keynes is convinced that, look, here is the way a nation is supposed to develop. So you put in stimulus, the stimulus will do something, mathematical equations come in and, they will show that the money multiplies and whatever, something happens and, the nation develops. That's wonderful. Indeed, we know this is true. I mean, this is the standard thing we always fall back on, which is what we often call deficit financing. So we just fall back on this option where nothing else works. And because we know that mathematically it is perfectly sound and there's nothing wrong with the Keynesian idea at all. So it is mathematically absolutely correct. So the multiplier effect and all that, that's just correct. So Keynes is convinced of this matter. And then he gives the mathematical solution to it. Of course, it is quite possible that I may be convinced of something, but I may not be able to give an argument for it. That's possibility. For instance, take Sriharsh, who is a post-Shankar philosopher. So he's a 11th century philosopher. Now, he did not believe that you could give any argument for something, but he already believed in something called the Brahman. But he said, no, we cannot give arguments for it. So he doesn't have any method except the method of refuting everybody else. So he said that if everyone gives some argument about anything, I will refute them. What does this establish? Well, it establishes that nothing can be established. However, how do we run our life if nothing can be established? So he said that the way to run your life is by having faith in Ishvara or something like that. This is one very standard argument for belief in God, and I don't think it is a bad argument at all. It's quite a good argument actually. So especially if you believe in the power of reason, and if you can show that reasoning is hopeless, then that's a pretty good argument to believe in some other supernatural power that kind of runs the show, so to speak. It's a pretty popular argument. It was very popular in Europe at one time for a very long time. For probably 200 years, it was very, very popular as an argument. So take Descartes. People say he has a method of doubt. Well, does he really have a method of doubt? I don't think so. But look, what does Descartes want? He wants that knowledge should start with certainty. Well, how are you supposed to get any certain knowledge? So he's groping around here and there. He doesn't know what to do. He travels and all that. And finally he sits down and, well, he doesn't really meditate, but whatever. I mean, he just does, he asks some various questions. And then probably he falls back on something like doubting. And he realizes that there is something he cannot doubt anymore, which is that he's thinking. So does he really have a method of doubt? I really doubt that very much, because he only employed it once. He never employed it again. So he only employs the method of doubt once in the first chapter or maybe the second chapter of Meditations. And he never in his entire work, Descartes wrote lots of things on mathematics and physics and music. His first book was on music, by the way. So he wrote hundreds and hundreds of things. There are many things he didn't publish, but he never employed the method of doubt anywhere else. And that tells you something, by the way. It tells you that the method you employ is always determined by the object of your method. If the object of your method is knowledge, then it is actually quite obvious that you should employ the method of doubt or something like that, because you can't start with knowledge to get to knowledge. You have to start from ignorance now, or doubt or something like that. It's practically forced on you. So the more your object is a meta question, like what is knowledge, what is existence, what is being, or whatever, that's going to determine what your method is going to be. If at all there are methods in philosophy, I kind of doubt whether there are methods in philosophy. Now you may say that no, there are methods, logic is there, whatever. What has logic achieved? So if you look at logic, what they did have some sort of method. It was right at the beginning of the 20th century. So you have 1905, Russell writes a paper on denoting, and this paper is immensely influential in philosophy, incredibly influential. It is hard to imagine a paper which has had more influence, just like K.C. Bhattacharya's paper Swaraj in Ideas. It is a very influential paper in not just Indian context, but many people who study Indian philosophy from abroad also, they also read K.C. Bhattacharya's paper and they realize that there's something very important going on in it. In the same way, Russell's paper on denoting, which was written in 1905, that paper had a huge influence, incredible influence. Well, what is the point of this influence? Russell's whole point was that we must somehow arrive at the answer to the question, what is there? What is there in the world? Well, how do we arrive at this answer? Because he's not ready to accept any answer given by science or anything. This is clearly a meta question. So the meta question has to be answered by, well, you can't get into the world anymore. So what are you going to do? So you're going to look at meaning. When you have to look at meaning, you really have to look at logic. And so you are forced to look at meaning. This is something that has to be there in philosophy, by the way. You really can't get away from meaning because you are asking a meta question. There's really nothing else you can do. But now we know, well, I'll come back to what we know now. Since so much of water has flown down the bridge, we have to, I will have to sum up as to what is it that we know now about what all this analysis has led to. So I mentioned Russell, and so what does Russell do? He produces what is called logical form. This was a key idea in 20th century philosophy, and it is not an idea that was available beforehand. It was available, but people did not concentrate on it. Once we had the structures of logic and we had variables and all kinds of things, people understood that there is something called logical form. Once we got onto logical form, we tried to bleed some philosophy out of it. When we tried to bleed philosophy out of it, well, we were able to get some results. Now these results are all contested, but there are some results. But again, we did not do logic because we just had to do logic. That's not the reason why anyone does logic. well, at least the people who founded logic, they were not doing it because of this. Look at Frege. Why is he founding logic? Because he's interested in a very different question. He's interested in the question, what is a number? Again, he has an object of inquiry. Then the method comes, which is logic. In the same way, when you have in Russell, he has an object of inquiry. What is metaphysics? What is there in the world? Are there fictions in the world? Are there non-existent entities which also exist? Well, how do we answer such a question? Well, what he does is he constructs logic. Once he constructs logic, he can get logical form. By logical form, he can show that, he can show something. He can show that fictional entities don't really exist. For this, you have to believe that names are abbreviated descriptions. But that's all. We need not get into technicalities. The issue is you have a question in your mind, you have an object in your mind. This object is going to determine to a great extent what you want to study. If you look at Plato, you look at Aristotle, you look at Indian philosophers, you look at everybody. People often say Indian philosophy is very distinct from Western philosophy. Well, to some extent, maybe this is correct, but really, I think this is a question of aims. So in Indian philosophy, one aims at liberation, but I'm not completely sure to what extent were this. Some of the schools were they very deeply interested in liberation or not? Sometimes they are just interested in analysis and nothing else. So I don't find this distinction between Indian and Western philosophy to hold much water, except that they are done in different geographical localities. That's hardly of any relevance. So when you are doing Indian philosophy, when you're doing Western philosophy, when you look at Plato and Aristotle, what do they really do? All of them know that meta questions are being asked. When you ask a meta question, you can't do experiment, you can't get into the world, I can't go to the market. So what will I do? What am I supposed to do? Well, what I'm supposed to do is I look at the meaning of the question. I look at the meaning of the word. So we look at the meaning of the word. We know today from hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of arguments that have been given. And these arguments have come from everywhere. It is not that they have just come from philosophy. They have come from every other discipline. We know that we cannot make a distinction between the meaning of a word purely and a fact. So meanings and facts are kind of, it's like a tangled web. So since it's a tangled web, which is not, it is not good. That's actually quite good news. It's not bad news at all. So ultimately, when we are asking a meta question and we are first looking into meanings, you have to do that. If you do philosophy, you look into the meaning of the question. Once you look into the meaning of the question and it starts getting clearer, you are actually getting back into answering the question about the word. Ultimately, a philosopher wants to know what's the structure of the word. That is why he asks meta questions. When he gets into meaning and he clarifies the meaning, which I think some people confusingly call conceptual analysis. So he clarifies the meaning. He gets back into the world, so to speak. So we now know that by clarifying meanings, we don't just clarify meanings because that's just we are not writing a dictionary. What we are really doing is we are getting back into the world again. So when Moore clarified what he meant by the word good, and Moore was not engaging in conceptual analysis, though he's supposed to be the father of conceptual analysis. Good cannot be, rather the object that the word good corresponds to, that cannot be analyzed at all. It is an unanalyzable thing. And so here is a person who's supposed to be the father of conceptual analysis telling us that the object of analysis is not even analyzable. So that is why I'm slightly skeptical about this notion of conceptual analysis. But when you, even if you are not skeptical of it and you engage in conceptual analysis, you are engaging it because you have a particular object in mind, and that object cannot be thought of in any other way than through the concept, which means you cannot think of that object unless you look at the meaning. So you look at Aristotle, he continuously says the same thing. He says, well, all right, I want to talk about substance. Well, what does substance mean? This is always the question he asks, but Aristotle never means to ask the question about the meaning of the concept. He's actually asking the question, what is the meaning of the object substance? He's not asking the question, what is the meaning of the concept of substance? That's not what he's asking at all. He's asking, what is the meaning of the object substance? So when Plato asks the question, what is knowledge? He's not asking the question, what is the meaning of the concept knowledge? No, he's asking the question, what do people mean when they say, I know something? It's something very real that they are inquiring into. But they phrase the question in such a way that you might think that he's asking the question about meaning, which is true. He is asking a question about meaning, but he's also asking a question about an actual phenomena in the world. So philosophers are not wrong when they are saying that they are actually looking into the phenomena of the world, without really getting into experiments and things like that. There is a way of looking into the world through meanings, because meanings themselves are engaged in the world, so to speak. They have some independence of the world, but they are also engaged in the world. There is no meaning without a world. And to some extent, for philosophers, there is no world without meaning. So these two things kind of go together with each other. And that is why when the object of inquiry is there, firstly, you have to have an object of inquiry. Secondly, you need to have an attitude towards that object. That is, you need to have a particular conception in your mind that, look, I'm going to look at this object from this particular way. And then the method will kind of just describe itself. I personally think that methods are not that important, to the extent that you should not be completely irrational in your method. There has to be some rational control on your method. So, but beyond that, there's really nothing much. Once the object is decided, once the idea is there, and once you have the perspective there, these two things are absolutely necessary for any inquiry to take place. Firstly, you need an object, and secondly, you need a perspective of the object. That is, you need to be convinced that this object exists. And secondly, you need to be convinced that this is the nature of the object. So Plato is convinced that the good exists. Now, you may think this is a very silly idea. What do you mean the good exists? That's very silly. But Plato does not take it in a silly manner at all. He is absolutely convinced the good exists. He is convinced that I must see the good for me to be a politician. He is absolutely convinced of this. And then in the Republic, he gives a kind of vague working out of this idea. I don't think Plato thinks that he has succeeded in working out some idea, but he gives as pleasant a picture as possible as to what the idea is. So in methodology, you don't start with the method, you start with the object. And then you look at, you need to have a perspective on it. So if I'm just studying political science, but I have no opinion about anything, I am not an anarchist, I am not a liberal, I am not a fascist, I am not anything, well, then it is very unclear what I am doing in the subject. You need to have some strong opinion. Say you may be an anarchist, for instance. All right, then your method is decided for you. You need to look at other people, you need to see what their opinions are, and you kind of start rejecting them based on argument, based often on experience, actually. So if you were actually believing, if we really believed in experimental stuff, then we should immediately reject neoliberalism, because it has been shown to fail in every possible country you can think of. Neoliberalism has been practiced in Latin America for years and years and years with disastrous effects. We all know this. I mean, it's just a question of opening your eyes and reading the literature. And not just we, IMF and World Bank, they all know this. So neoliberalism is essentially a philosophy. It is not an economic doctrine which is proved by mathematics or anything like that at all. It is simply a philosophy. And well, I would consider it an ideology. Philosophy is not an ideology. So idealism is not an ideology. But neoliberalism is an ideology. Ideology means that it has no backing with argument. There is just, I believe this. So, I mean, then you can't fight with the person. I just have this ideology. There's no argument. There's no reason that you can give to the person to change the opinion of that person. So it's a complex thing as to how do you work out with ideologies, which is why political science is a very complex subject. But in philosophy or in any other subject, you first have to have a target object in mind, then a perspective on that object in mind. Once these two things are established, and by perspective, I don't mean that this is going to be relative and there's nothing like this. I mean, perspectives can be perfectly objective. Then you basically work out whatever method you have, as long as it is within some rational control. I'm not saying by rational that it has to be like game theory or something, nothing like that. I mean, there are very obvious things that you have to do. I mean, so you cannot study Parmenides by looking into the history of Roman thought or something. That's not something you could do. It would make no sense at all to do that. Or I cannot study differential calculus by looking at the sociological impact of tribals in Bastar. I can't do that. It doesn't seem to make any sense at all to do such a thing. So you should not do things which are completely senseless, but the method will itself become clear if your object is clear and the perspective on the object is clear. Once these two things are there, the method itself becomes, it kind of lays itself out. You really don't have to worry too much about the method anymore. But of course, it has to be under some rational control. It can't be just some wild thing. So then the notion of a method may possibly have to be taught to you. But beyond that, no human being requires this kind of teaching, frankly speaking. Everybody knows what they're supposed to do. So what we do not know is what is it that we must pursue as an object of inquiry. I think that's the whole problem with methodology and method. The problem is not that we do not know what the methods are. We all know what the methods are. We all know what the methodology is. The whole problem is not this. The problem is what is the object of my inquiry? So once, as you saw as an example, I'm not saying this example is the right example or the wrong example. I have my own opinions about it. But when you saw that Professor Raghuram Raju said that his method, he has an object. This is what I'm supposed to do. He has a perspective on that object. Now he puts it into practice. That's the right way of doing things. This is what all philosophers do actually. It is not like he's the only person who's doing this. Every philosopher, whether it is David Hume, Berkeley, Dinnag, Vasubandhu, the Vasubandhu doesn't have to be convinced by argument that some particular aspect of Buddhism is right. He's already convinced of it. He already has a perspective on it. What he needs is just this thing that, I will construct a whole nice intellectual framework by which will support this thing. I don't think that intellectual framework is necessary actually, but whatever. Maybe they are just engaging with Hindus in this matter. It would have been a better thing if they had not engaged, but that's a separate issue. Maybe I should wind up. So what I'll say is that when you look at method and methodology, they are not very clear words. It's not very clear what we are supposed to do. At least I feel personally very confused when people ask me what research methodology is, because I'm not sure what this is supposed to mean. If you simply mean that you have to write a citation or a bibliography, that's not methodology. It is just a kind of, these are certain things you need to do to write something in such a manner such that it is acceptable to others. So, I mean, if you are an original thinker or something like that, well, all right, you don't have to use the bibliography and citation methods of APA or something. It doesn't really matter to you. So far as I know, no original thinker uses these things. But because we are in an academic institution, so we tend to use these things. But yeah, but that's not research methodology. The real question of research methodology should always be, what is your object of research? What is it that you want to research? That's the real question of research methodology, and no amount of courses in research methodology can teach you this thing. It has to come from within you. What is it that I want to do research in? It could be possible that you are deeply moved by the notion of justice. Then you look into the question of research. So how do you research justice? Well, there are various opinions on it. Maybe you should study it. I think Professor Suneja was mentioning this yesterday, if I'm not entirely wrong. So he said that, or maybe I am wrong. I think it was Professor Raghuram Raju who mentioned this, that, the first thing you do in research is that you say, look, this is what has already happened. And now I'm going to proceed further. Yeah, well, okay, you can do that. It's not necessary to do it, but you can do that. Also, research has to, the basic idea is your object has to be clear. Once you have an object, you need a perspective. Once you have the object and the perspective, that's it. The method will clarify itself. Just like in statistics, you give them an object that, look, this is what you need to do. And they will tell you immediately, okay, I think Poisson distribution is better here instead of some other kind of distribution, or maybe linear programming is better here than something else. So the methods are all there. They are all waiting for to be used. What you have to do is simply know what the object is. That's the critical aspect of research. What's the object of my research? Do I want to measure the height of Mount Everest, or do I want to know what knowledge is? Or even what height is, for that matter. Plato has some long things to say about what tallness is. He often engages in this rather unusual discussion because he doesn't know whether it's a relation or a monadic property or things like that. But the issue is, what is your object of research? Once you know what your object of research is, and once you know what your perspective is, the method will itself come. That's not going to be such a big deal. Sometimes maybe the method may not come. And that could be interesting. It could be very interesting that you have an object in front of you and the method is not very clear to you. So I think that happens in philosophy a lot actually. So we do have the object in front of us. We know that we have to ask the question, what is existence, or what is knowledge, or what is being? But the method is unclear to us. But once you get to a meta level, you really have no choice but to ask the question, what do our questions mean? But that doesn't mean that we are looking into the meaning of the question. We are really asking the question, what is the object of my inquiry, in a sense? So in philosophy, when you have an object of inquiry, you again ask the question, what is my object of inquiry? It's a kind of odd subject in that sense. But that doesn't mean that it is a meaningless inquiry or anything. It could be, but it hasn't been shown to be meaningless as yet. But anyway, I think I should stop talking, and if there are some questions, then it would be nice to have them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, It was very enlightening, especially very new thing to look at, new way to look at research and methodology. Now I invite Professor Balaganapati to reflect on our speaker, and then we will move forward towards discussions. We will take up questions. Okay, Sir Balaganapati, sir, are you, are you online?
Archana, did you make him co-host?
Wait,
Please make sir co-host first.
Okay. Where? I have made him co-host.
Yes, and please unmute.
Okay, unmute. Ask to
Yes,
unmute.
yes.
Okay. Ask to unmute. Sorry.
Okay. In the meantime, Archana, you can also
Okay.
Summarize.
Yes. Sir has very brilliantly spoken about methods and methodology, where he has enlightened us, stating that first, it is the object that is required in order to have perspective, and then methodologies. Okay, and I don't want to dilute what sir has said, so it will be better if we just go forward with the discussion. I can see, sir, Dr. Jayanti Sahu has raised his hand. So, shall we take questions now?
Yeah, I'm
Yes,
happy
you
to
can
take questions.
Archana, and please try to unmute Bala sir.
Okay, Bala sir is there. Okay.
Bala sir is there. Please unmute.
I have okay, wait. I have asked to unmute, but this option is coming. Ask to unmute is coming.
Yes.
Is he, sir, am I audible to you?
I think there is some connectivity issue. I guess, Archana, I think we should move forward and we can take up questions.
Okay, so
I can see Jayanti ma'am is already there. She has raised her hand.
Okay,
Please unmute Jayanti ma'am so that she can place her question.
Okay.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, sir, Dr. Nilanjan, and for your enlightening lecture. So I have some problems regarding taking the perspectives into account and talking about the methods, as you said, because in philosophy generally the philosopher they don't develop any method, but if we go by, you rightly point out that if we go by Hume's ideas and impressions, then we develop some kind of method to understand their philosophical studies. But certainly method plays a very important role in philosophical studies, to my opinion. Maybe I'm wrong, but if we see that if we want to study existentialism, then there is a certain method to understand their philosophical structure, the phenomenological method. Then if we want to study Hegel and Marx, there is a particular historical and dialectical method is there to understand the philosophy. They might not develop the method for their philosophy, but there is a proper philosophical method and methodology is there to understand their philosophical structure. It is easy for us to understand if we develop a certain kind of method to understand their philosophical structure. That is the one point which I want to make. The second thing is that when you said that we go by perspectives and there is the object of study, that is, I agree that. But when you say that perspective already there, that I disagree, because suppose take for example, as you said, Upanishad, the idea of the consciousness or the self, the concept of Brahman is already there. It was not the kind of concept that it was there, because you see that when we take something or when we say something, we generally take into account the social situation, and the social philosophy is a dynamic subject, so it always takes into account history of ideas. So if Upanishad was a second stage of development, and when they criticize the earlier portion of the Vedas, and there is a philosophical development and reflection was there to understand the rites and rituals in a different way, and then they develop the perspectives. So what my submission is that maybe I'm wrong, but what my submission is that already when we develop some kind of perspective, we take the social situation and history into account and the facts into account, then we reject that notion, then try to establish something. And that is how the philosophy moves. The Charvak, when also came into existence, materialism, they also see the some of the things which are the wrong practice within the Upanishad and the earlier Vedas, they try to develop that way. So can we reject the totally the historical analysis and develop a perspective? I don't think that. Even also Shankaracharya, because in Upanishad we generally said there are three methods of understanding the Upanishadic study: Sraman, Manan, and Nididhyasana. This is a kind of method. They said that first you listen to the teacher, then you exercise on that, then you develop a kind of self-study, that you then you develop your perspective. So I just see that to my mind that perspectives comes much later. Yes, I agree with you. Perspective is needed and object of study is already there. And to looking at that, we can develop a method. So that is way. But I just don't. Could you please comment on that? I may. No. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Well, there are many ways in which people speak of method. So as you were speaking of method, there were two different meanings to it. One was that method means what is the philosopher employing as a method. The other is how do I study that method? So I need some study of, I need a method to study that philosopher. Well, that's not a method that anybody is interested in. You can study a philosopher any way you wish. So that's of no relevance. And it's like asking, how do I study school mathematics? Well, you can put in 8 hours a day, 5 hours a day. All right, fine. You can do whatever you wish. Or if you're super intelligent, you spend in maybe half an hour a day. So there may be, I don't think one employs a dialectical method to study Marx. Marx is possibly employing a dialectical method. I don't think he's doing anything like this, but whatever. He thinks that history proceeds in a dialectical fashion. He's not employing dialectical method to prove this. He's just looking at history. He's looking at the various movements of history, and he puts this perspective of dialectic on it to suggest that that is the truth about history. So to say that Marx is using the dialectical method is kind of odd, but well, I don't know. There may be different ways of expressing what, maybe you are expressing the same thing that I am expressing, but it's just you are using different words. There's actually a joke about Plato. So because I was reminded of this when you were speaking of method. I think that there is a scholar who says that Plato was very big about method. All the time he keeps saying, we should use method, we should use method, we should use method. But when you read his dialogues, no method is apparent. It is impossible to find out what method Plato is using. It is practically impossible to do it. It's very hard to do that. So it is not very clear where Plato uses any method. Yeah, that's true for most philosophers actually. So Hegel is expressing himself dialectically. Well, that doesn't mean he's using a dialectical method. He is expressing himself dialectically. But maybe this is because the object is such that it forces a kind of method on you. I think that is what is really happening. Often it is the case that the object you study uh, forces a kind of method on you. I don't think Marx used dialectical materialism, because if he were using dialectical materialism, then what he would be studying would be something independent of dialectical materialism. But he thinks that the history itself is dialectically materialistic. He's not using dialectical materialism, he is imposing dialectical materialism on history. And he's saying that this is, history has a certain pattern of events. You look at the history of pattern of events, and well, it seems like dialectical materialism is the right way to look at it. So there's an object history. You have a perspective, the dialectical materialist perspective, and you throw that perspective on that object. I don't mean to say that this perspective is relative or anything like that. No, I don't think so. I mean, it's quite possible that Marx is right, that, I mean, Marx's analysis of society through classes is quite right. There's nothing particularly wrong about it. So, which is why it is also very boring, because it is just true. So sometimes people just get bored by reading Marx. But that it is just true that there is what is called class war. I mean, many people have said that this is quite true. I mean, it is, but since it is true, but not economically fruitful, so we don't know what to do with it. It is politically fruitful, but not economically fruitful. But Marx was trying to do economics, not politics. So they're kind of subject relative issues in Marx. So, but anyway, I mean, what Dr. Sahu is saying is correct. I mean, perspectives can come from socio-economic circumstances. Yes, very much. Marx lived in a particular economic situation where the ideas that came to him came from that situation. And of course, it came from humanism and the Enlightenment and whatever. So he's very much a post-Enlightenment figure. But all these ideas come to him from the humanist and Enlightenment tradition. So, and he puts a specific dress to it because of the Industrial Revolution. So yes, there is no doubt that the perspective that you have will be historically informed by wherever you are situated. There is no doubt about that. So there, Dr. Sahu is very right. The perspective doesn't come from just nowhere. It has to come from somewhere. And it has to come from where you're historically situated. No doubt about that. There, Dr. Sahu is absolutely right.
Okay, I think we should take another question from Sajid. Sajid, are you here? I'm unmuting you. You can ask your question. Yes, Sajid.
Hello, sir.
Yes.
Actually, I have my question is somewhat related to the previous, question in some respects. But besides, talking about metaphysics, if we talk about research in a very narrow sense, like trying to do something, as a PhD thesis or something. So having a perspective and an objective of study, like if we already have a perspective of that also, so then how come something new is going to be proved or something new is going to come out? Isn't it that we are going to go in circles in that manner, that like we have a objective and then we have a perspective of it? So aren't we doing the circular thing again and reaching our own conclusions again at the end of the day?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's a good question. So it might suggest that, well, I mean, if you already have an object in mind, the perspective is already there, then what are you supposed to do in PhD? Well, one of the things you have to do, firstly, your perspective might be a very fresh one. So Buddha had a very fresh perspective on in his times about whatever was the universe and what are human beings and whatever else. So he does have a very strong perspective on certain things, and it is completely new. So your perspective can be completely new. Even if the question is very old, you may be investigating what is existence, but your perspective might be completely new. And so if you have a new perspective, you can have new arguments supporting that perspective. But it is also possible that, let us say you have an old perspective. Let's say you are just an idealist or something, or you're a liberal in politics. Yeah, that's fine. But you could give new arguments in favor of liberalism. Arguments that are very surprising. So it is not necessarily obvious that just because you have an object and a perspective already, that doesn't mean that you don't have anything to say. Your perspective may be completely fresh. Marx's perspective on history is something that is surprising and completely fresh.
Can I intervene a bit, sir?
Yeah, sure. Please go ahead.
But again, the argument is that we are again going back towards the same thing in a different, trying to have a different, fresh perspective, but of the same thing again, the prior conviction that I had. So isn't there the possibility of the entirely an alternative or a change of the perspective itself?
You can have a change, different object. We are not really looking into the same thing because we don't know what that thing is. When we ask the question, what is knowledge? We don't know what it is. So then we have a perspective. You can have a counterfactual analysis of knowledge or some other analysis, whatever. But the issue is, I really don't know what it is. So when we say the question, we are looking into the same thing. That's not the right way to put it. We really don't know what that thing is. I don't know what is being. So I look at various perspectives on it. But that doesn't mean to say that I'm looking at some relative perspective of it. No, I may arrive at a perspective that the whole thing is relative, which could be interesting. But that doesn't mean that the object is already known to me. No, it is just that I have an object in mind which I want to study. I know very little about it, if not nothing at all. Then I have a perspective on it, that this is the way I want to look at this thing. And then this is what most great philosophers do, really. And probably all great social scientists, economists, everyone has that kind of approach. If you really look at how they work, this is how they work. So, and then the method will come. And all of it can be completely new. There is nothing, when John Nash did game theory, it was completely new.
Right. Thank you, sir.
How is it possible to emerge given self-interested individuals? That is practically impossible, but you can show it by game theory that it is possible. Not just possible, it is almost mathematically certain that you will get cooperation. So there is the object is, it can be a very old one, but the perspective can be completely fresh on it. And it could even be completely true. Because we don't know what the object is. So by our perspectives, we come to a better and better and better understanding of the object. But we are not moving around in circles or anything like that. That's not correct.
Okay. Thank you, Sajid, for your question. Now we have another question from Dhananjay. I'm unmuting Dhananjay. Dhananjay ji, you are unmuted. Now you can ask your question.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This is to Dr. Nilanjan. How do you look at a priori in this context? And then my next question would be, how do you explain thing in itself by dialectical method? Because both would go into different direction. Are we assuming something called thing in itself in terms of research vis-a-vis social sciences? These are my questions.
Okay, I'm not sure whether I get the drift of the questions. The first question is about a priori. I think the second question is about things in itself. So, well, a priori is just a term that is used by philosophers because they think that what knowledge they seek is always a priori by nature, which is because they think that it is necessary by nature. So if that's what you think, then well, fine, you do a priori, and essentially you'll have to do linguistic analysis, then there's really nothing much left to you to do. So, but probably philosophers should not tie themselves down so early in the subject. So if you think you are doing a priori, some people think that this is correct. Philosophy is about a priori structures. A priori means that it does not require experience for you to know this thing. That doesn't mean that it doesn't arise from experience, but it doesn't require experience for you to justify that knowledge. So you could say that philosophy is a priori, but I don't think anyone really believes this. I mean, it seems very hard to accept such a thing. There are people who are hardened rationalists. Lawrence Bonjour, for instance, he's a hardened rationalist. So, I mean, yeah, you can look at any question and think that whatever I establish from this would be a priori. There's some reason to believe this, actually. So if you're asking a meta question and you can't get into the world to answer it, then your answer must be a priori. But we know that there must be some problem in this because, as I said, there is some advancement in the subject because we know that questions of meaning are very difficult to disassociate from questions of fact. And so therefore there is really no reason to establish that there is any a priori knowledge, or for that matter, any a posteriori knowledge which is independent of meaning. So it won't be very easy to establish that there is pure a priori knowledge. So maybe unless you think about mathematical truths. So mathematical truth is always a problem. But what about things in itself? Well, we are, I think, forced to think that the world is in some way unknown to us because we experience the world through sense expression, sense experience. And so there must be the world which is in itself what it is. So I don't think that the notion of a thing in itself is some very mysterious thing. I think it's a very natural thing actually. So we really don't know what the world is. We experience everything through sense experience, and then we give expression to that sense experience through various means, whether it be poetry or mathematics or whatever. So we approach the world in various ways. All these ways are perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with them. But exactly what the world is very hard to say. So there is something in the world which is beyond our sense experience. We know a good deal about that world too. But how the world looks is very hard to say. So maybe there is something like a thing in itself, but I don't think it's anything mysterious or anything like that. There's nothing like that. It's just that it is just a corollary of the fact that we do see the world through the way the world appears to us. So there must be a reality to it, which is something that we can never really grasp. But I don't think this is some mysterious thing. It's just a natural fact about the world.
Thank you.
Any other question from participants?
I think Dr. Garima is raising her hand.
Okay. Let me unmute Garima ma'am.
I'm
Yes,
so sorry.
Garima ma'am.
I'm not able to locate that raise hand option in my laptop.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so
But
Dr.
please ask
Nilanjan,
your
I
question.
just wanted to ask a simple question. If we have a strong conviction or perspective, can you please tell me about the quest about objectivity, and doesn't objectivity get lost somewhere if we have strong conviction or perspective? And the second question, can a researcher, according to you, change his or her perspective in the process of doing research and take a U-turn and come back to her or his research question and change the entire thing?
Okay, yeah, those are very interesting questions. And also, incidentally, I am also unable to find out where the raise hand issue is. So I don't know where it is. I have been looking for it for like 5 or 6 days now. But
Yeah, every time I raise my hand like a student.
yeah, it is very strange. Something's wrong with my laptop. But anyway, I think your question was, is objectivity hurt by looking at perspectives? And secondly, can you change your perspective completely? Yeah, you can change your perspective. It has happened a lot in philosophy. So Plato well, how should I put it, de-Socratize himself after, let us say, the early dialogues. So he does change his perspective. Initially,
So
he just
I just ask, in the
expressly.
process of doing that research, only the particular
Yeah,
research,
that's
and
right.
your
So Plato was heading forward with pursuit of definitions. Then he kind of has a change of heart and thinks that, just pursuing definitions is not enough. There must be something we are doing to pursue definitions. So then he realizes, he comes to the theory of forms. Even more surprisingly, you take a look at Frege. Frege thinks that, mathematics is founded on logic, whatever. But later on, he had a complete change of perspective. He thought mathematics was founded in geometry. So this is because the logicist program failed. So indeed, this is something that should happen to you if you are a really great researcher. So if I'm just a researcher and I may be doing, lots of very good things, but if I don't change my perspective, I really haven't done any good research. So a really, truly great researcher is the person who can change his perspective. So Marx starts with Hegel's perspective, but he changes it later. That's why Marx is so great. Great philosophers are often marked by the changes that they make. So Aristotle has a particular view in the categories, and he changes that view in the metaphysics. So that is because he's just a great philosopher. As he pushes the boundary of inquiry, his perspective changes. And by perspective, I don't again mean, I'm not getting at reality. So to come back to your objectivity question, that's a very important question. I think the very reason that we change our perspectives is that we are chasing objectivity. So we initially think something is true, but then we realize that all our arguments are showing that no, something is terribly wrong with my whole perspective. So then I have to, unless I want to marry perspective with ideology, that happens maybe in politics, where you marry the perspective with the ideology and you then forget truth. But if you are just pursuing truth, then you must change your perspective. So I may believe in Brahman and I start investigating. Ultimately, I find there is nothing like this. So then I must change my perspective. This is what happened to the Buddha, which is why he's such a great philosopher. He changed his perspective. He pursued and pursued and pursued reality till he found out that there is no reality. So ultimately, he had to change his perspective. By changing his perspective, I don't mean the idea is that he seems to think that the truth is very different from what we thought before. So yes, if you are a truly great researcher, you do change your perspective.
And objectivity kind of thing. So what is your take on that?
I think the idea is that we get closer and closer to the truth. So there is something, if nothing was objective, then we wouldn't inquire into anything. The very notion that we inquire means that there is some objectivity there. And so when we have some perspective, we kind of think that it is something there that we are capturing with the perspective. But we change our perspective sometimes. And sometimes we don't. That is all right. But the issue is this. You are saying, is it possible if lots of people have different perspectives, then what is the truth? Yeah, that can happen in various subjects which are very complex, like political science. You can have various perspectives on how to run a state. Then which of them is true? Is there any truth like this? Oh, that can be a very, I don't know whether there is any political truth at all. It is very difficult to say, because ultimately it is all founded on human nature. What is human nature like? So that we can have different conceptions of human nature completely. I think Dostoevsky said that human being is a person who can get used to anything. This was his definition of what a human being is. If you have a definition like this, then anything is possible. I mean, not that Dostoevsky didn't mean to say anything is possible, but he said this is what the definition of a human being is. A human being is something that can get used to anything. So it all depends on what human nature is. So political science is dependent on that. So, but there is no biological clarification as to what are the political opinions of human beings. So
That again is a perspective.
yeah, I mean, it's a very complex issue as to some truths are not easy. That's something we just have to accept. There are very hard and difficult truths. Scientific truths are very easy to access because I have instrument, telescope, this, that, whatever. Yeah, but political truth is not so easy to access. One of the great contributions Plato made, which we often forget, is that he made this distinction between truths very easy to access and truths that are hard to access. So he said you should not be defeated by the idea that just because philosophy or political science or geography is difficult to do doesn't mean that therefore there is no truth in it. He said the truth is there, it is harder to access, that is all. So that doesn't mean that there is no objectivity. There is objectivity. It is harder to access. Everything is not like a stone lying outside on the street so that I can pick it up. There are truths which are very hard to access. And so we really need to struggle hard to get to those truths. It's like climbing Mount Everest or something, but at least Mount Everest is there so you can climb it. But political truth is not obviously there so that you can climb it. It is there, but to climb it, it's gonna take a long journey. It's a long journey to study the thing. That's what Plato said. He said, you just study it then. But there is objectivity. It is not that everything is just relative.
Wonderful answer, sir. Now we have another participant, Ravneet Kaur. She has an answer. Ravneet, I am unmuting you. You can ask your question. Hello, Ravneet. Ravneet, you can have your question. I think there is some network issue. I have one question. So,
yeah, go ahead. Sure.
yeah. So for you said, sir, that we always have a new perspective and there is always a space for new perspective. And that new perspective is a fresh perspective. At the same time, you are saying that this perspective is to somehow connected with the old perspective. So if it is connected and associated with the old one, so how it can be a fresh perspective? That is my query, first question. And second thing, whenever I know that you are a logic professor and you are very good in logic, so it is little bit a teacher kind of question because I teach logic to my students. Okay. Okay. So Ravneet can, I think she is audible.
Am I audible?
Yes,
Am I
Ravneet,
audible?
you can have your question, and after that, please, sir,
Okay.
answer my question. Yes.
It is actually related to what you were commenting just now, this idea of having fresh perspectives and going back. I actually see there is a gap, whenever we have classroom teachings, and when I have also been, taught many a times on the issues of, philosophical concepts, that, there is this problem of not getting connected to the idea of going back to where these concepts actually emerge from. So for instance, when I was reading Deleuze for my thesis, then I had to go back to Bergson, and when I was reading Bergson, I had to go back to basically Parmenides's poems. So and I found there is a connection, there is a correlation between all of these, but it was becoming difficult for me as a layman because I'm not from philosophy. So it was getting difficult for me to connect and see how these issues, they keep getting reinvented and regenerated. And when we read, for example, notion of truth in postmodernism, to us, it was given to us as if it is something new. But when I go back and read classical philosophy, I see the whole notion of multiple truths it was present there also. So am I making some point here? Sir, hello.
Yeah. I think what you're saying is that often when we study things, we are in our path of study. Various opinions come up that have the same force as what we are studying. So, or we often go back to earlier opinions which reflect later opinions. So yes, that's there. I mean, it is. I think partly this is because there are so many great thinkers, and they all have their intense insight into some things, and so it just follows from this that none of them are really irrelevant. So it is not like Marx has totally replaced Hegel or Hegel has totally
Right.
replaced Kant.
Right.
It's just that they all have certain insights, and
Right.
these insights are very powerful. They have been arrived at by some kind of reflection or intuition or argument, rarely argument, but mostly reflection and intuition. And then they are supported with arguments. So,
But when we are applying these concepts to some of our as in when we want to interpret text and we want to apply these concepts, it becomes a problem in the sense as in where do I start? How do I quote? Or how do I mention? Which belongs to who? As in how do I put it in my research? That is a problem. I mean,
okay, I
yeah.
see what you're saying vaguely. Yeah, I
Yes.
think there is one aspect I forgot to mention, which may be an answer to your question. There are certain subjects, take the subject of philosophy, mathematics, political science, maybe not so much in mathematics, or physics, where it is not that you are never a student of philosophy. You are essentially a philosopher. The reason why you study philosophy is not because you are a student of the subject. Yeah, we learn many
Right. Right.
things, and so
Right.
that is why we call ourselves students. But you are not a student of the subject. You are yourself a philosopher. That is why you study philosophy. A
Right.
person is
Right.
very deeply interested in mathematics. That is why they study mathematics. They are already mathematicians. They kind of hone their subject and their specialty, and they come to learn many other things. But ultimately, they have an intense, deep mathematical mind. Hence, they study mathematics. The same thing applies to philosophy. So when you are looking into research and you are trying to figure out who is quoting what, I think what is really happening there phenomenologically is that you are actually getting away from philosophy into some dry clerical kind of activity, which is why you find it difficult to do, because you are getting away from what you really are.
Yeah,
You
and
are a
also what
philosopher.
happened? Yeah, and
You
also
are a
what happens
philosopher.
is
So you are enjoying reading
right.
Bergson, you are enjoying reading
Yes.
Parmenides. So you are having a lot of fun. But when it comes down to writing it, then you get, oh God, what kind of clerical stuff I have to do now? I have to find out who said what, which is a
No,
very
it's not.
foreign activity to philosophy. I mean,
Sir, I wasn't talking about clerical work. What I was talking about is when I have to uh, interpret a text, and for example, I have to talk about Deleuzean, Deleuzean concepts. Okay, let's take an example. I have to talk about rhizome. I have to talk about deterritorialization. I have to talk about lines of light. while I do that in my research, I see a lot of it is coming from, some other, original concepts. So how do I negotiate, between the two? How do I say that, okay, I'm only, talking about what Dilaj is saying and I stop here, or I, go back and, look into the seeds of these very concepts. And,
No, I think what
also,
you should
yeah,
be doing is that you should go with your first intuition. If your first intuition says Deleuze's concepts are derived from some earlier concepts,
right.
not necessarily consciously by Deleuze. Maybe Deleuze is not doing this consciously. But you as a researcher have found out that some of his ideas are coming from earlier historical predecessors.
Right.
So you should
Right.
immediately mention that. You should say that, yes, some of these ideas are coming from earlier. You should not hide that thing. You should mention it immediately.
Okay.
Because
Okay.
your intuition
And
is pushing
yeah.
you towards that. So you should
Right.
trust your intuition. Always back your intuition.
Right, right. And another problem in research nowadays is that see, if I am writing, I'm nobody, when I'm writing my research, I'm not an established thinker. But if I have arrived at some philosophy of my own or some some perspective of my own, it becomes very difficult to validate that until unless I interrelate it to something which has already been done. Otherwise, it won't be taken. It won't be welcome as such. This is another problem because sometimes when I write an article and I send it for peer review, I get a lot of reviews regarding that I should be validating my arguments with some pre-existing thinking process which has been published. So this is another problem, sir, we face. I think most of us face this.
Yeah, this is true. I also face the same problem. It's just that I don't
Yes.
know. I think in academics, this kind of thing happens a lot, which is, I think, not very good. I mean, it is not good for our subject. We must encourage
It's not.
clear and good thinking. And it is just because it does not have references doesn't mean it is wrong.
Yes.
I
Yes.
do. I think that is very bad and very unfortunate of us. I think we should encourage big thinking, clear thinking, and it does not matter whether there are 20,000 citations in it. That's not relevant at all. It
Yes,
is
but I
just,
think
I mean,
we have unnecessarily made some protocols, of research.
yes,
which
that is
need
true.
to
I
be
think
shut
there are
away.
certain pointless protocols of research that have just become entrenched. And I
Yes.
think this is partly because lots of people who come into research have this odd feeling that this is how research is, but that's not the case at all. I mean, you should always be favoring people who are arguing originally about something. Just because there are no citations in it doesn't mean anything at all. I mean, if the argument is good, it is good. You have to accept it. Just like a poem is good doesn't mean that a poem has to cite everybody else. That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, but I think this is downright of postmodernist, philosophy, where the very idea of original and novel is actually being seen from skepticism, and
That's a
we,
separate issue, yeah.
yeah. But it gets related to when it comes down to practical research, because then everyone thinks that, oh, nothing is original, nobody wants to do novel work, and there is no originality. All that there is interconnectivity, and that is what one researcher should do. And so there is a lot of I would say underconfidence that gets built up in.
Yeah, I think you are very right about it. This happens to
Yes.
me also.
Yes.
So, I mean, unless and until you're referring to 20 other people, then you are not doing research. But that is not right. If you have an original idea,
Right.
that should
Yes.
be acceptable to people. Just because you're not referring to 20,000 other people doesn't mean anything then. I mean, if you're referring to 2 people, it's fine.
Yes, I would really appreciate if scholars like you, when you give lectures, you should also, encourage this kind of audacity in the young scholars, that
I
they
think
must,
young scholars must be audacious. If they are not audacious,
Yes.
we will never discover anything in the world.
Yes, yes. Thanks, sir. Thanks a lot.
Jairo, you
thanks.
did not finish your question in logic.
Yeah, I was asking to you, sir, that I teach logic. In my class, whenever I go, students have a very typical question. Whoever study logic, that what is the relevance of this symbolic logic or logic into the real world? How this logic subject is connected to the real world? That is the question I always face. Sometime I ask them, and sometime I tell them, okay, logic is something which is very deep dive into the real world, and we try to understand through symbols and through formulas. But I would like to ask you this question, if you can
That's a
reflect
very,
upon it a little bit. Yeah,
that's
how
a,
can we make our student understand the relevance of these symbolic subject, or subject like logic, which is really very important?
it is. Well, there are two, three reasons why it is related to the real world. One is that logic is about the structure of language. So if they are interested in the structure of the language they speak, then they should be interested in logic. Like, this is what the structure of language is. So it is not that my reasoning is totally unstructured, some free thing flowing here and there. No, there is a kind of structure in it. And what is so interesting about it is that it is hidden structure. So I can study economics by simply reading newspaper, because newspaper deals directly with real world. So, but then if I study economics in a college, a lot of things will be told to me which have nothing to do with the real world. But that doesn't mean that it is irrelevant. It is the structure of what you are reading in the newspaper. In the same way, when you read a newspaper, you read reasoning. I can study logic by just reading the newspaper. But what the logic tells you is what is the structure in that reasoning? Why is that thing reasoning at all? And how do you make a distinction between a good and a bad reason? So if you want to make a distinction between good and bad reasons, which is such an important thing in the real world, what could be more important to us than to know what is a good and a bad reason? Though that is very difficult to distinguish, but in most situations. But logic tells you how to make a distinction between good and bad reasons. So that is another extremely important reason to study logic. Everyone must study logic simply to know what are good and bad reasons for accepting any view. That is why informal fallacies are so important. So those are two very good reasons to study logic. One thing I always tell my students, which always puzzles them, is this: that say we have a semester of, I don't know, 4 months or something, 3 months. So I tell them that we will study logic first day, and at the end of the study, what have we achieved? So the students, naturally the students don't know. They say, oh, we have learned quantification theory, we learned truth table, this, that. But I tell them that in 3 months, after 3 months, you will be exactly where you were before you started studying logic. That is, you would have learned nothing at all.
Yes.
Why? Because logic is about the structure of the world. It is not about the world itself. And the structure of the world will always be whatever it is. It is essential. Logic is not visible to you. So there is a sense in which you really learned nothing. You already knew whatever there was to know. The structure is already there in your language. There is nothing for you to know in it. So essentially you learned nothing. So this surprises them a lot, because they don't understand what it means to say to study a subject for 3 months and not to learn anything at all. But you already know it. So what is there for you to learn? The structure is there already. You already know what is the difference between good and bad arguments. Logic is codifying it and telling you what it is. So there is a sense in which you learn nothing when you learn logic.
Very true, very true. And very aptly you have said that we are trying to understand the structure, the deep hidden and deep dive structure of the dialogue, I must say, or the argumentation, which is very crucial in each and every field, whether you are doing logic or you are doing debate or something like that. It is crucial for us to understand the deep structure so that we can create new arguments, we can create new perspective.
Yeah, also to distinguish good and bad arguments. Lots of people give very bad arguments. So we must be able to
if they justify their bad argument, don't you think that it is also logical? If they are able to justify their bad arguments, means I know Protagoras.
Justification of a bad argument, it will only get worse and worse and worse, essentially. That is what ideology is. Ideology is the justification of bad arguments.
Yes, aptly said, Professor Nilanjan. And I think we have done with questions. Now, thank you. I would like to thank you, Professor, for delivering such a wonderful lecture and enlightening. You have resolved so many queries, so many doubts which we have. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for giving such a word of wisdom and enlightening lecture. Thank you so much. Thank you. Now, I would like to invite Nidhi ma'am. So we have our another speaker of the day, Professor Sirola with us. So Nidhi ma'am, are you here? Nidhi ma'am, are you here?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
So,
earlier I did not have that permission, right? So,
okay, okay. Sirola sir, am I audible to you? I'm just trying to just a second. I'm just doing some setting.
Now you have, there was a problem.
Yeah.
So
Hello.
Hi.
Welcome, sir. Namaskar. Nice to see you.
Same here. Good afternoon to everybody.
Yeah. So thank you for joining us, sir. Before you begin, I would like to invite Nidhi ma'am to introduce you to the participants first.
Sure.
Thank you. Nidhi ma'am.
yeah. Thank you so
please
much,
proceed.
Dr. Zarunisha. So after that enthralling lecture by Professor Bhaumik, we have with us yet another personality, Professor Vikram Sirola. And sir will be delivering a lecture on philosophy and science, a methodological quest. And I would like to take this liberty, sir, to introduce you to the participants.
Sure.
So Professor Vikram Singh Sirola is a professor of philosophy at Indian Institute of Technology, IIT Bombay. His area of research includes social epistemology, moral epistemology, analytic ethics, philosophy of sciences, philosophy of social sciences. Professor Sirola has received various awards and recognition for excellence in teaching. He has published widely in Journal of Indian Council of Philosophical Research, Indian Philosophical Quarterly, Athens Journal of Humanities and Arts, Philosophia, e-Journal of Philosophy and Culture, and the list goes endless. Professor Sirola has also taught various courses such as Western philosophy and advent of modern sciences, philosophy of language, research methods in social sciences, and philosophy of science. We are extremely grateful to you, sir. I now request you to begin with your session. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Nidhi, and thank you, Zarunisha, for the invitation. And I'm thankful to Professor Bala Ganapati. And I'm happy to be here. And it's a rare occasion for us to interact with a variety of audience coming from different disciplines. So I take it as a good opportunity to have a meaningful interaction during the course of this session. And I will request you that those of you who would have certain doubts in between my talk, feel free. You can raise hand, and I will try to address. So once some part of the discussion gets, the presentation gets over, so please feel free to raise certain doubts. And at the end, definitely we will be having a more elaborate discussions. So what I have done today is when I was planning to prepare for this talk, I was having in mind a usual audience in philosophy. Then I checked with Dr. Jerunisa, and she said, like, we have a mixed audience, and we have teachers from various fields, like including in management, political science, history, and maybe from literature. So this talk is in a way based on a philosophical take on methods, keeping a variety of disciplines in humanities, social sciences, and then at the end I try to address some issues in science. So basically it is a kind of an interaction of philosophy as a discipline has with all other disciplines, right? So we know that philosophy do not have its own subject matter. Philosophical inquiries are basically about something which may be a subject matter of some other discipline. So when we talk about philosophy's interaction with science, then we end up in a kind of a binary, right? So we say that, okay, this is a philosophical debate and that is not philosophical debate. And you will see where in various cases, there are certain, you can say, conflicts or contentious issues which arise out of this binary. So if we shift the focus on the interaction and what we as discipline gather from each other, that is somewhere I feel philosophy gains, and also it helps other discipline to know more about their own subject matter. So I'm trying to somewhere situate this talk, which probably I believe would be relevant to all of you who come from variety of disciplines. So I'm not keeping the philosophy audience in mind at all. So feel free, all questions which arise from your perspective, your disciplinary background, it will help me to relook at those issues a little more in depth. So let me share my presentation. So I have made a few slides which may be useful, to really browse through certain things little more rapidly. Otherwise, we may not end up, discussing much. Okay, so I hope this is now visible, right?
Yes, we can see your slides.
Okay. So I have titled the talk as Philosophy and Science, Methodological Quest. So this is a quest, and philosophy is known to have quest on variety of things, but this becomes more fundamental because it is about methods. And this very course which we are having here in this platform is basically looking into the methods which we call philosophical and how other discipline make use of those methods. So it is possible that other discipline, for example, science, makes use of certain contribution, methodological contribution made by philosophy. But this is not where exactly I will really focus, because I'm not saying it is not true, but there is more than this which can be said when we talk about these disciplines which come together, and then they help us for creating knowledge and understanding the very nature of knowledge. So if you ask me in philosophical term, this talk is primarily a talk, epistemological talk, right? So it's a discussion on epistemology, and I will tell you briefly, those who are not initiated on those terms, what epistemology means. So the structure of the discussion will be something like this. I have divided into 3 levels. So I can say that I am pitching it at 3 levels, though there are a lot of overlaps between these levels. One, as a philosopher or a student of philosophy, I have a duty to introduce others with the nature of philosophy. And we also ponder upon this question, repeatedly. We go into it, and there are ways in which we have reinvented the very nature of philosophy. So it is not a stagnant question, and we do not have a fixed answer to it. But the very nature of philosophy is something which I would like to share with you, how we look at it. But I would not like to define it in any way. So my understanding is that it is better to understand the nature of philosophy by doing it. So what we are going to do today is basically doing philosophy, but we are going to discuss its interaction with other disciplines. So it is not directly I'm going to tell you what the nature of philosophy is, because that is not possible, and it would lead to a variety of conflicts again. But we will discuss more about the methods. The second level in which I'm planning to keep the focus is the demarcation which we can be drawn. So demarcating philosophy has been an issue which we do discuss in philosophy as well as in other discipline, that what exactly you demarcate. When we say demarcation, it is like drawing the boundaries, right? So what is philosophy and what is not philosophy? It is in some those sense. So what I'm planning is I will not do it by excluding it from other disciplines, but by highlighting its expanse into other disciplines. So for example, where history, certain talks in history, certain discussions and writings in history, how they become philosophical. Similarly in sciences, it could be similarly on certain discussions on management, political science. So those part in the discipline which we say are philosophical. So whether philosophers address it or they are addressed by the very experts in the discipline, it is not the very important question. The question is, what exactly does that boundaries which get crossed with philosophy? What exactly is this expansion? So I plan to do it by pointing out when a discipline like history or science stops practicing itself and adopts a philosophical stance. So I'm not saying it is not doing history or not doing sciences. I'm putting it a little more radically. But the idea is that it is not typically doing history. It is not typically doing science. You know, when we say somebody, what do you do when a person says, I do science, you don't expect that person to be pondering upon questions like what is science. You will not expect that person to discuss questions like, are electrons real, right? So these realistic questions are something which become issue about philosophy of science. So when you deal with historians, you know, historians deal with a certain way of doing history. But if somebody asks them what exactly is history, then that kind of a question would be more of a philosophical. So there are a lot of historians who have made a serious contribution in understanding the discipline and its nature. For example, because some of you may be from history, you can enlighten me more on this. But let us say, is history something which is to be done the way, you know, it is? So itihas is the way, you know, things are, the facts, matter of facts are, or the way you see it. Because the moment you say the way we see it, then there are ways in which historians can have a different interpretations of the very fact available there. So facts themselves do not talk to you. It is the historians who make those facts, you know, interact with those who are interested in those facts. So these interpretations come in pictures, hence the ideology, hence, you know, the political interest, and variety of things play, you know, importance. So when it comes to understanding this very nature of history, then this is more of doing philosophy. This is what I want to say, the demarcation of philosophy is how it expands to other disciplines. The third and the last level, which I have in mind, is how pursuit of knowledge, we believe, and understanding in any field is primarily an epistemological quest, right? So that's what I say. This talk, you can say in philosophical term, is basically on epistemology, right? Some aspect of it I am going to share with you. So where philosophy, which could be said to be an individual pursuit, and other disciplines like sciences, they dissolve their strict boundaries and share a common space. So I'm saying that the epistemological quest cannot be segregated in terms of philosophy or science or history, right? So there is certain shared space in which all discipline share, you know, those questions. So this, whether it is science or history, would be an epistemic inquiry, right? So what they do can be broadly seen as epistemic inquiry. And when we talk about methods, then that is precisely what philosophers are interested in, right? So it includes methodological inquiry, definitely. So that's what I'm saying. It is basically an epistemological quest, which we may be dealing with. Now, those who are not initiated in philosophy, and you may wonder why I'm using this word epistemology. So I'm putting it in a very, very simple way, because again, it is not an attempt to define this. You know, I'm not here to define things. I'm here just to share with you how it can be understood, how it can be used. So let us say you are into a crossroad, and this road, you are looking for a road to Delhi, right? So there is an interesting example which Plato uses in one of his dialogue called Meno, Road to Larissa. So I'm picking from there and replacing Larissa with Delhi, because the Delhi is more relevant to us, and many of us are looking ways to reach Delhi, you know. So some are stuck in the borders, but some have reached. So road to Delhi becomes quite relevant. Now, if we say, who can guide you better, right? So who is a good guide? The one who have traveled to Delhi using one of these roads, or the one who has a true opinion? Again, this is Platonic quest. I'm not, you know, taking you there, but I'm just putting it in my own understanding, that one who has true opinion is enough guide, because many of the travel agents, you can't say that they have visited all possible places. They've been to some places, and some places they have not, but they can be a good guide. They have gathered enough information from various sources. So if you are asking this, that one who knows, that means the one who has traveled, is the only good guide, or the one who has a true opinion can also be a good guide. So what we are asking now, epistemologically, what we are asking is, knowledge and opinion, are they two different things or same? And if we say they are different, then how different they are? So if we say knowledge is something which is deliverance of reason, you arrive at deliverance of reason. Intuition, because there are certain unmediated knowledge, it could be demonstrable. So demonstration is one way to say, yeah, this is how certain things exist. And perception, right? So knowledge can be identified with some of these, ways of understanding it. And opinion, a non-demonstrative, based on faith and testimony, right? So in this case, if I ask you, whom will you, prefer to guide it by? The one who have traveled, that means one who knows, or one who have gathered it by testimony, by certain other facts, but he has never traveled. So he has a true opinion, so he can also guide you. But can you seriously be only going by a person who have traveled, right? So this is a epistemological inquiry. So there are ways in which we say, yes, this distinction is important. Knowledge is different from opinion, especially true opinion. But this distinction may not really be very important in our day-to-day life, right? So we say that knowledge and opinion are distinct, but not for all form of inquiry, right? So when this meeting was fixed, it is not that we are looking for variety of proofs to say that, yes, there will be a meeting at 3:30, right? So one mail or one phone call is good enough to believe in this. So opinions very often in our everyday life serve the purpose of knowledge, right? So this is how we understand. So everyday life, if you look closely, then epistemological inquiry helps us to see the difference, but do not, give too much of weightage or importance to knowledge alone. But when it comes to scientific inquiry, this distinction becomes very significant. When it comes to any formal inquiry, this difference becomes very significant, because the fact which science proposes cannot be acceptable unless it is demonstrable, right? So there are debates which we will touch upon at the end, where you will see that knowledge seems to be very distinct in some aspects of our life, that is epistemic aspect of our life, but not everywhere, right? So epistemology deals with those kind of issues. Okay, this is enough as a kind of a prelude to what I'm going to do. And because I locate my talk in epistemology, so I believe it is important, because if I simply say epistemology is a theory of knowledge, it makes no serious difference to your understanding. But now I've just explained there are a variety of ways in which epistemology can be attempted. So philosophy, when reflects on methods, then I can list a number of them. I have not done that because it won't really be so important for what we are planning to do here. But I have listed just very few for a sample of variety. So Socratic reflection. Socratic reflection, Socrates have contributed substantially in the Western philosophy. And all questions, if you see in Western philosophy, they begin from Socrates. So he says philosophy brings to us to know in different ways things we already knew in some way. So it is not that philosophy is bringing to us a new subject matter. So what difference philosophy makes if we already knew something? What exactly philosophy does, right? This is what the quest would be. So it is possible to raise and solve philosophical problems with no clear idea of what philosophy is. It means maybe in your everyday life, you are making use of some of the philosophical methods without explicitly being aware of it, right? So you are doing philosophy, but without knowing what philosophy is. So if to put it in other words, let us say we make use of geometry, right? Geometrical knowledge is formalized But this formalized knowledge, let us say Euclidean geometry, it is formalized in certain way, and we have a complex structure which can be talked about without even referring to any part of the reality. But we are already making use of it. When I'm raising my hand, when I'm moving around, walking around in the space, I already have a sense of geometry in me, which I make use of. Anybody who fails to have that sense of geometry would not even be able to move. They can't manipulate the space around them. So geometry is already there in any organism which moves and makes use of the space. But we have formalized it in a certain way so that a complex structure, geometrical structure of the reality can be grasped, right? So we can understand more than what we really do with the space around us. So similarly, we do philosophy, but a formal, explicit understanding of philosophy would help us to touch upon some complexities which otherwise would remain untouched. But no great progress can be made unless these questions are explicitly asked, right? So when we are saying progress, this progress is a formal progress, right? A philosophical inquiry gives access to this progress and some answers to them attempted, right? So we pay more attention to raising questions, and our answers are even unconclusive. We do not really bother much. So we are still deliberating in philosophy various or variety of questions in fresh, outlook. So whenever we have certain developments in science, it helps us to understand certain aspect of our knowledge system, and accordingly, philosophical attempts to answer these questions, they are updated. So it's a very live, way of doing a discipline. Scientific and historical thoughts also demand such reflections on their own work, right? So you, as I said, like mathematics, similarly, you can talk about science or similarly about history. But only philosophy has this peculiarity that reflection upon it is part of itself, right? So you will not say reflection of science on itself, on its own nature is science. You can't say reflection of history on its own nature. What history is history, right? So that becomes philosophical. But reflection of the nature of philosophy is still philosophy. So that is the peculiarity, that reflection upon a part of itself is something which is philosophy. So theory of philosophy is that what we call nature of philosophy is itself a problem of philosophy. But nature of science, when we say nature of science, that becomes a philosophy of science issue, right? Mostly. Whether scientists do it or philosopher, it doesn't matter. But I'm saying that is where the philosophy expands to other disciplines. Unlike history, sciences, or poetry, right? Philosophy has that unique aspect to it. So the question we can keep in mind is, who does theory of history, science, or literature, right? You can add to it a number of other disciplines too. So who does those theories? Are they historians, scientists, or the experts of the discipline, or they are some philosophers, or that very activity is philosophical, right? That is what we were trying to talk about. So when you talk about these contributions to philosophical method, as I said, there are a variety of them. This is the list. So Socrates, with which we started, that everybody is doing philosophy. So we are already pondering upon something which we already knew. So he's inventor of philosophical method. So his method sometimes is popularly called dialectical method, right? So there are ways in which who lies on the other side, of the argument are people, right? Even the dialectical methods are being used by other philosophers. But in Socrates, it is people's conversation, right? There is a way in which people are conversing with each other, and this conversation leads to certain point of views, and which get further questioned, contradicted, or weakened, so that more stronger arguments may be constructed or arrived. That is how the dialectical method grows in Socrates. And Socrates' works are mostly discussed by Plato. So that is the only window we have to his methods. So next comes Plato. Now, Plato is known for this dialogical contribution. So there are dialogues, and we read Plato only through those dialogues. So philosophy is seen to be same as thought, because he tries to reach to your thought process. And once you understand the very nature of thought, you understand the nature of argument. Then René Descartes, he is one of the foremost philosopher in the modern time. We call him father of modern philosophy. His discourse on methods particularly was a kind of a very well-written systematic text on methods in philosophy, right? So he has influenced dramatically at that time the rise of modern science. So if you say in Europe, if you read a little bit about this Renaissance, some of you might be quite aware of that period, then you'll say that Bacon, Descartes, they really influenced, the scientific outlook and made possible to inquire into the physical reality, right? It's completely separated from the mental. So that kind of a possibility of natural science was what René Descartes contributes. Then comes Kant, and Immanuel Kant is so important to philosophy that we say, if you have not heard about Kant, then you might have born before Kant. So his importance in philosophy is quite well accepted. So he has influenced the sphere of historical and humanistic studies, right? So his methods are actually what we call the transcendental nature of methods. So I will not get into those details right away. And finally, I'm just touching upon, as I said, finally Wittgenstein. In the contemporary philosophers, he is one of the most remarkable, philosophers, and his thought have shaped the modern analytical tradition, particularly, and given a new direction. So he's compared with Copernican revolution, right? So we say Wittgenstein has brought Copernican revolution in philosophy. So his book, Tractatus Logico Philosophicus, was a small piece, but very substantial contribution in certain way to shape our understanding about philosophy and its relation with language. So he says that all philosophy is a critique of language. So he limited the role of philosophy to only critique of language, right? So it's a tool. Philosophy can only give you a tool. What you do with the tool, you can use it in a variety of investigations, right? And that is how he limits. And anything which is beyond those investigations of using those tools is not philosophy. So those inquiries have to be done separately. So he makes those demarcations very, very strictly. Now, that is a kind of a little background for all of you. And then we talk about methods now, right? So as I said, I will keep it at a certain level where all of us can participate. So all of you are teachers, and I'm sure from your disciplinary expertise and background, it would be a useful discussion at the end. Now, if you talk about method, because we are focusing on method, then the origination of this very word is methodus, the Latin word methodus, a composite word for meta, and hodos, that is in pursuit of something. So how you do that and fulfill that pursuit by a certain way. Thus, methods signified as in pursuit of a certain end, along with the specified way, right? So you specify a way of pursuing, certain end. So this is what methods are important for. Now, we will elaborate on that shortly. Now, if you see philosophical significance of the concept of method, the way, right? So it's like the road, the path to something, right? So the choice of a path, the choice of method decides what exactly you will end up with, right? So if it is based on observation, then you know that these are empirical investigations, right? If it is the reason which guides you, the path is reason, a critique of reason, then you know where exactly and which kind of entities you are investigating. So method decides, the end. So more broadly, it is the way of one's devotion of life to the true and right, right? If you expand it to that level, true and right. So true is epistemological, and when we say right, then it is ethical. So method is not important only for epistemological inquiry, but even in ethics, we pay attention to the methods. And as the way of questioning search with such a devotion, right? So that is how methods are made, so significant in all disciplines which have made serious progress in the last, century. So philosophy as questioning and pursuit of knowledge does not offer the end product of such a search, right? History can give you an end product. Science can give you an end product, right? As a bulk of knowledge or information. So that is not what philosophical questioning will reveal. We, being finite, fallible, mortal humans, find this pursuit rather endless courses, right? So when we say we are finite, like the very epistemological quest, if done seriously, you would know that how limited resources we have to investigate. And we are fallible. When we say we are fallible, how often we can go wrong, right? Some of us believe still that science have given us a large understanding about the universe, life, and variety of physical things around us. Then if you look a little more closely, you would know that how many places science have gone wrong. If you pay little attention to the history of science, you will realize clearly that very often, right, science keeps on building on the mistakes, and there are ways in which it has made contribution in our life, but then they realize the theoretical background was incorrect, right? So you may have appropriate technological development, but the theoretical grasp of the world can often go wrong, right? So it is not that we have unraveled with certainty certain aspect of the universe and sciences, and the other aspect will slowly get unraveled. That's a very naive way of looking at it. So no discipline can make that claim. So philosophers are a little more aware of it, about this limitations which any knowledge system may have in it. So we pay more importance to ignorance, right? And a variety of writings are there now that it is important to be aware of one's own ignorance. It is the case of my search, any search, or an exploration. We only possess a kind of a pre-knowledge or perhaps a vague awareness of the object of our search. If you see, a lot of knowledge is already there, right? It is already there, and we make use of that knowledge as given, and we build on it. So there is a kind of a pre-knowledge, and that knowledge gets tested by certain observations, right? In science, if you look at it, and in variety of other disciplines also. But the fundamental questions about what is that pre-knowledge coming from, what is the source of it, how authentic it is, we do not have so much of luxury to ask. We cannot afford to ask. We cannot reinvent the wheel all the time, right? So certain things are already given to us. We build over it. So the way we test the reality, it is a very limited sense in which that test can be, conducted. Okay, so pursuit of knowledge. Now, when you talk about pursuing knowledge, then there are two ways in which this pursuit can be taken up. One, pursuing knowledge for its own sake. Now, I think most of you will identify with this, that knowledge can be pursued for its own sake. When we say it, means there is no other end to it. So like pure science is undertaking certain studies just to investigate the nature. So it is not necessarily aiming at developing a technology, right? So we can say that pure science hold more of a philosophical attitude, right? In that way, we can understand the pursuit of science for its own sake could be a philosophical attitude. But when we identify that pursuit with for the sake of certain purpose, right? Then we say it's technology, it is medicine, it is behavioral psychology, biology. It's more of a kind of a empirical goals which we try to attain, right? So knowledge for its own sake, because you want to investigate and know more about the universe, right? If you don't know anything about the galaxies, it doesn't really make much difference to our life here right now, right? But if you come to know more about it, then it is possible that this very life we understand better, right? But day-to-day life really doesn't get affected by our knowledge about or quest about the universe. But in technology, there are certain specific goals. So instrumentality of knowledge becomes very important. That means what we know acts as an instrument to attain something, right? That's why sometimes we define science as offering instrumental knowledge. So the aim of its method is always determined by the practical usefulness. So you will not, inquire something from scratch. It is not something which is out of no motivation. So sometimes we say pursuit of knowledge for its own sake is not having motivation. So which motivation? That is a kind of goal. We are not looking for its practical usefulness. But pursuing knowledge and looking for instrumentality, its usefulness, is something which needs to be segregated, right? So now this is what I'm saying, that I'm trying to see where philosophy comes into. So when we talk about pure sciences, there is a lot which philosophy interacts with. But when you talk about technology, then philosophical interaction becomes more distant, right? You can reflect upon the way technology is, you can talk about its ethical aspects. But when it comes to pure sciences, it integrates quite deeply into it, right? So if I know more about certain aspects of science, as a philosopher, I can contribute better, right? So this integration would be required more when it comes to pure science. But when it comes to medicine, engineering, or empirical sciences, then this integration is a bit distant, right? So this is how we have been talking about the expansion of science, expansion of philosophy in other disciplines. Accordingly, by late 20th century, it was believed that two most fundamental tasks for established sciences in its research are to explain, please pay attention, this is quite important even to understand the very nature of, let us say, social science, because social studies turning into sciences have followed almost a similar path. So you will see a little later that I talk them together. So we will not make much difference between social sciences and pure sciences, because methodologically there is no significant difference. It is only the difference of the object of social science and object of sciences where there would be some difference. So if you look at the last century, the development there, there are two fundamental tasks for established sciences in its research, and why science took over as we can say as a discipline which is now being followed more rigorously than any other discipline. One is to explain a certain phenomena by means of theoretical hypothesis, right? So law of nature. So when we say something is a law of nature, we are able to explain, let us say, gravitation. We are able to explain variety of phenomena. But we need to have those laws, the theoretical hypothesis in science. Then we predict a future or an event or a phenomenon. If this prediction is not fitting along with the theoretical hypothesis, you will not be saying that it is established science, right? You may have a profound theory, but that theory can be, used to predict something correctly. Then the profoundness is proven. Otherwise, you cannot have a theory which is profound, but it fails in making appropriate predictions about the events or phenomena. So there is a way in which science can be tested all the time. Now, these kind of things which were followed in social sciences also have adopted that explanations have to be given based on the theoretical hypothesis. So you have theories in almost all disciplines, and the predictions. So those disciplines have theoretical ground, and those theories are used to predict. So economic theories are used to predict the economic behavior, right? The way scientific theories are used to predict the events or phenomena. So explanation and prediction, in a way, defines the nature of sciences. This is which I'm saying, right? So last 100 years, you can say, have shaped the very nature of science. So anything which fits into science have to fulfill these two, that is explanation based on certain theories and predictions. So predictive success in science have played a phenomenal role. This we are trying to somewhere adapt in social sciences, but you cannot actually have so much of accuracy in it. We know there are a variety of factors which are so different when you talk about nature, which is physical, and the social behavior, right? So society and nature cannot be comparable in all aspects. So this pursuit of knowledge, the basic conditions, as I said, are explanation and prediction, right? They necessarily make research a science having the usefulness or instrumentality of its knowledge. So the question which you again can ask here is, what would be the status of philosophical investigations? Are we explaining things and based on those explanations, are we predicting something, right? This now you can see very clearly is not what we do in philosophy. So philosophical theories are not basically made to explain something, right? It is more about a kind of a descriptive role which we play in philosophy. Those theories are basically having a descriptive role, not explanatory, right? I don't know if this makes good sense to you. Any of you who can explain that, what is the difference between explanation and description? I mean, you might have been familiar with these two terms, explanation and description. Any of you? No, because it will bring you out of the slumber also. I mean, I know long talks, after lunch might be making you feel sleepy. So just if some of you can help, and I know that you are awake, somebody is listening to me, Otherwise, after a while, online, you lose that touch with the audience. Just come up, somebody. Yeah. Kamla Srinivas. You're raising hand, right? Kamla Srinivas. Jeronisha, you are muted. Please unmute.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Sirola. I can make an humble attempt to the question that you've asked.
Yeah.
Probably the explanation can be in the form of, it keeps you within the boundary, as you said. Okay? Yeah. So within the given subject matter, you will explain what the facts are. So explanation is about the facts. Again, looking at the domain of philosophy, philosophical inquiry is not factual, right? It is beyond the facts, searching for that what is hidden. So probably the other part which you said, so probably within the science or within the history, within the domain of certain subjects, there is a probability of looking out for, if I come to know the nature of things behaving in this manner, probably given the fact that these prevail, it is quite likely for, if it is sociology, people to organize themselves in this manner. If it is psychology, then people to behave in a particular manner. But when it comes to philosophy, it's not about prediction. It's about description, as you said. I need to describe why things are as they are. So the description is more broader compared to explanation. And therefore, philosophical inquiry is more descriptive. And that's how we are able to derive meaning, derive at meanings, derive at a clarity, a certainty. And that gives you an impetus to look at life from a very broader perspective.
Okay, very nice. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Ravneet Kaur, you are spoiling my slides. I expect it from students, but not from teachers. Okay, that's okay. Ravneet Kaur. No problem. That's a blank space. But now it will get filled with certain more slides. Now, see, what was there in my mind, that's very nice, the way you put it. To put it again a little more simply, I would say explanation would require, certain laws to be in place. Description, if I say description would be simply putting facts as it is, right? So if there is, let us assume a rail accident, you have a newspaper which gives you that what happened, right? And newspapers are supposed to give you mostly the facts, the way it happened, right? But the moment you say, no, it was a mistake of the lineman, or it was a signal failure, there was a technical fault, right? So you are explaining what led to, the accident. So explanation would require, so a technical fault means the signal didn't show correctly, a lineman didn't show the sign correctly, or whatever it could be. But explanation is to explain why certain things happen. Can we say philosophy have that kind of an overburdening role to explain things in life, right? And we sometimes believe it has. And description would be simply the way things are, right? You simply describe them. So if you look closely, again, science is doing the explanatory role, or it is philosophy which is supposed to do those explanations, right? So this question, sometimes we get a little lost, and we believe that philosophy, of course, has a role to explain, right? If I say why I am here, right, and why so much of unjust in the society, so this why has to be explained. Is this the role of philosophy? This is what we are saying. So as when I was listing those methods, I said, Wittgenstein said, all philosophy is a critique of language. So when you simply say it's a critique of language, it is like a librarian arranging the bookshelves. So you look at the catalog, you say this series number, this is the book I'm looking for. It won't take any time to locate that book. So it is only arrangement. But how that arrangement is being used, is that also role of philosophy? So some analytical philosopher would not really agree that explanation is our burden. We arrange things because it helps you to systematize thought. And when the systematized thought are a certain way placed there, then you can make use of that in sciences, in history, in variety of other disciplines. So explanation and description, right, are two different things. Now, if I ask you, some of you who are in history, that is history supposed to describe or explain, right? So these are, again, philosophical questions in history. So what historians do is an explanation, or it is a description of the reality. As I said, itihas, this is how it happened. So you're simply, trying to give the audience a kind of a detail, and that details only includes a matter of fact, or it is basically explaining it by certain interpretations, the cultural, the political, you give that entire narrative in certain package. So that becomes an explanation. In sciences, we know, without the law of nature, you cannot explain anything. Why water boils at 100 degrees? Yeah, Dhananjay Rai, I will just come in a second. So why water boils at 100 degrees would be basically when you have certain laws to explain the intermolecular force. So you'll say, okay, heat increases the intermolecular force, right? So then you can explain that in water, it is 100 degrees. So it changes, the state. Now, that is a way in which laws of nature or laws of science help us to explain. And history, those explanations would come from certain, political, ideological grounding, which makes you to look and locate those facts in certain picture, right? So, but is philosophy doing the same job? This is what I'm trying to, figure out. Yeah, Dhananjay, please go ahead.
Just a second, sir. I'm unmuting Dhananjay.
Sorry.
Dhananjay, you can have your question now.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, just a query. I mean, because when I read both Althusser and Zizek, they defy this differentiation between explanation and description. And they even in Zizekian theory or Althusserian theory, descriptive theory contains explanation itself. Yeah. Moreover, in political theory, description or explanation would be posed against hermeneutics, that is understanding. So this is what is, I mean, my training would be, but and I want your comment on that.
Yeah, you're drawing me in the deeper water now. So I was trying to, swim in the shallow part. Thank you, Dhananjay, thank you. Yeah, so we can actually touch upon those aspects because this is contentious, right? This is debatable. But since the job here in this particular talk is to make this interaction, we can talk about this interaction between various disciplines and how philosophy plays certain role there, or how you can have an understanding of the discipline of philosophy from, let us say from history, from sciences. So description and explanations are intermingled, they can be separated, right? There are good debates in philosophy. So the perspective which you talked about are highly loaded with the political, groundings. So definitely there, it cannot be said that you can separate them completely, right? But for an analytical tradition, if you look at it from analytical tradition, because now this will be a completely two contrary systems, right? So there is a possibility of disagreement here, because I am talking right now, limiting myself to an analytical tradition where philosophy is used as a tool, right? So we are not really going to give any interpretation added to it. The moment you say philosophers have a role to, interpret the reality, and that also especially the social reality we live in, the life, right, we live. So this is a very loaded idea of philosophy. So we say sometimes that Wittgenstein is unburdened philosophy from this kind of a metaphysical role, right, or the interpretive role in it. So this is possible, right? So I completely agree with Dhananjay. Okay, so now we will come back. These discussions we can come back. So now philosophical inquiry, if you look at it, from typically the analytical tradition, and Dhananjay would be happy to, say this is why we said interpretation is required. So philosophical inquiry is not useful, right? Not practical, not meaningful to our living at all, right? So if those who are not dwelled into it, they don't lose anything big. This is how, we can say, because it's simply a tool. It's a kind of an arrangement, in a library. So those thoughts, if not arranged, and you still make use of in some way, right? Still the life goes on. So you can say that compared to other professional disciplines, philosophers are a different kind of professionals, right? I'm not putting it more radically. Some writers, add to it more. So I avoid that controversy. But in this sense, the philosopher turns out to be very different from other professionals, right? So it is typically, I think those who are in philosophy would understand, it is a kind of an analytical, understanding of philosophy. So coming from the analytical tradition. So now why I'm discussing it here? Because it is not that by knowing philosophy, then only you would know history better. I am saying a historian who is not trained in philosophy can still have a good grasp of what is the nature of history. A scientist, they have contributed significantly about unraveling this nature of science. So it is not that they don't understand. But as I have been saying, that an explicitly putting across makes it possible to know the usage of that tool better, to use it better. So there is a way in which what is history or what is science can be expanded in certain way, and our understanding of the very enterprise called science would go better, right? So it doesn't mean that every scientist need to know what is the nature of science. If you ask a scientist, it's a futile question, right? They are doing a laboratory science. They really do not really care, right, what is the nature of science. But somebody like, let us say, Einstein, Newton, or Bohr, if you look at it, those who got into those depths of understanding science, they really pondered upon this question, and they have made some contribution, significant contribution. So now this is one part of the discussion, right? Now I'm concluding it some way, concluding that part. So now this sketch will come in between, but fortunately the slide ends there, so it won't affect your vision. Notion of humanities. Now, if you look at it, I will talk about these three: humanities, social science, and sciences. Notion of humanities, now I've put it this way, is a study of how people process and document human experience. So if you talk about literature, even history, right? I don't know how many of the people from history here accept that history is humanities. You may say that we use certain tools which are scientific. So is it history fitting into humanities better than social science? That is a call we can maybe discuss in some questions. So it's a study of how people process and document the human experience. Philosophy, literature, religion, art, music, history, and language attempts to understand and record our life experiences. Knowledge of these records of human experiences give us opportunity to feel a sense of connection with others, right? So if you read a literature, even if let us say a fiction, a pure fiction, right? Why fiction have certain role in our life? Because it depicts the human relationship that connect with the other in such an explicit way that in reality it may take longer, to understand it. It's like, reading geometry in order to understand the very idea of space rather than just feeling it around you. So this connect with other is what which gets captured in humanities. So this knowledge is being used to authenticate certain practices and get a sense of direction towards our future, right? So what I'm saying is, in this second penultimate statement is that this direction towards our future is a prediction, isn't it? So is it not that reading fictions also help us to predict? So humanities fulfills this role of understanding, explaining, and predicting life world, right? And very quickly now, two more things about Jerunisha, you are coming up now. How much time I have?
You have time. You can go ahead.
Okay.
Don't bother about time. We have time.
Another 1 hour?
Yeah. We are enjoying your lecture.
Okay, I will not take 1 more hour. Maybe another 50 minutes. I will try
30
to, so that we have
30 minutes. You can have 30 minutes.
Okay, let us see. Because I know, it's not easy to tolerate somebody talking for 1 hour. Now I have crossed that limit, so it's 5 minutes more, almost 1 hour. Yeah. So let me see if I can wrap up a little quickly. But there is some part, right? If you are interested and we have time, we will cover that as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sure.
So notion of social science, if you now compare with humanities, the scientific study of human society does, and social relationships, right? And I just highlighted scientific, that's why we are calling it social sciences. So it's a branch of science that deals with human behavior and their practices in its social and cultural aspects, right? So object of this study is basically a social object, but the method is scientific, right? So we are again trying to understand the social object. We are trying to explain it and predict the social world, right? So the first one was a life word, I said. This is social world. Now the notion of natural science. So notion of natural science is a simple one which all of us are aware of, that is systematic study of structure and behavior of physical and natural world through observation and experiment. Right, so here observation experiment play the crucial role. In social sciences also they do, but not to this extent, right? You do not have laboratories now. We say that there are labs like psychology labs. So something like cognitive psychology, for example. I don't know where to fit it, right? We have cognitive psychologists in our department. They are in humanities and social sciences. But when they talk about lab and the way kind of instruments they use, it looks like they should be, more suitable somewhere else. So these boundaries are merging anyway. But natural science typically also does this understanding, explaining, and prediction of the natural world, right? So you have life world, you have a social world, you have a natural world. Are we talking about three different worlds? No, it is the same word. It is the different aspects of it which we talk about, right? So in these three kinds of discipline. So recalling what I have promised in the beginning, how much of it gets fulfilled, you can evaluate. That is 3 levels. As I said, the discussion would be introducing the nature of philosophy by doing it, or discussing methods, demarcating philosophy by pointing out when a discipline adopts a philosophical stance, right? So in other discipline, we do enter, and who does it is not important, but what is being done is philosophical. This is what we are trying to say. And the pursuit of methods. And pursuit of methods, whenever there are inquiries, they are basically epistemological inquiries. So philosophy and other disciplines share a common epistemic space. This is which I was emphasizing. So understanding, explaining, and prediction, humanities, social science, and natural science, all three are doing it, right? Now, what is this understanding, right? So let us say there is a horse. As I said, I kept a wide audience in mind. There are quite detailed discussions in philosophy, and whenever you try to swim in a shallow water, or you brush with a broad, brush, so obviously you miss out the finer aspects to it. But this is a way a philosopher can approach to, people from outside discipline. So please take it that way. It is a attempt to reach out to others, that what and how we do philosophy. So if you say, what is understanding? And there is a horse, and there is a picture of a horse, right? So what you call a picture? Is picture a representation of the horse, right? So we say it as a representation of the horse. And when you want to really understand horse, and you want to understand horse different than, let us say, a cow or a dog, so what we require in our understanding, we require a kind of an abstraction, right? We need to abstract it. So this is, let us say, if it is a Picasso's horse, right? Or Picasso won't draw the horse, the middle one. The Picasso's horse would be the minimum, right? The minimum which makes, these lines a horse. So if this can be extracted, and we say this is a kind of an abstraction of reality, right? So we have minimally abstracted something and we understand that. So are we saying only philosopher does it, or humanities is doing it, or social science does it, or is it sciences as well? So we are saying understanding is done by all with the similar methods. It is only that we in philosophy are trying to question what is understanding, how we understand something. So the question of representation, the question of abstraction, right? These are becoming important. So is it an abstraction of this picture, or it is an abstraction of the reality, right? These are questions in sciences as well. That when we talk about electron, is electron, the way we depict it in our theories, right? Is it an abstraction of a hard electron out there in the world, or it is a electron which is pictured or represented in a theory, right? So this is a question which we say scientific realism, right, deals with. So this is a map, and geographers do talk about, again, abstraction in form of a map, right? So social scientists are talking about similar abstraction. So it is not only humanities. Then when you talk about this, it is a, let's say, Higgs boson. Higgs boson, you might have heard some time ago, like God's particle, we have found, now we have discovered God's particle. In theories, it was already there for long, but we had certain observations, certain empirical evidence to say now we have discovered it. So that is our discovery. But can we say that we can capture it, right? It is not a real picture. It is only a kind of abstraction. It's a depiction of it. It's a representation of what we call a quantum field, right? A quantum field that is supposed to be responsible for giving particles their masses. So this is only a representation. But if you ask some scientists who have access to those discoveries or facts about those discoveries of Higgs boson, they can only say it's a kind of a we have very indirect proofs to claim that such particles exist, such fields exist. So this is only a representation. So this is again an abstraction. So keeping this in mind, why I was discussing all this. I was discussing this saying that what we do in humanities or in social sciences or in sciences, pure sciences, is not something entirely different. We are talking about understanding some aspect of the reality, and those aspects are different, but the goals are similar, right? So we are understanding, and how we understand it is again very similar. So of course, when some discipline like philosophy, which precisely talks about these tools, that what is understanding, what is knowledge, what are methods, are going to interact with these all disciplines who make use of these basic foundations of it. So we are saying that's the reason why philosophy is into all other disciplines. So if you want to identify the role of philosophy in it, these are the ways, right? So if you ask this question, let us say in any discipline, what is research? What is social scientific or scientific research? What is social scientific object or entity or reality? And why methods in research are so crucial, right? So you will not have very separate answers to it, right? So answers would be, because definitely there are separate subject matters to it, but what is social or scientific research? You can definitely, explain that. So let us begin with the first question very, very quickly. What is research? So any research has to be systematic investigation, right, into the study of materials and sources in order to establish facts and reach new valid conclusions. And I'm emphasizing again valid, because in philosophy, we say valid is logically valid. So I'm not saying true conclusions. right? Valid conclusions, because given the kind of facts which act as premises, it is only possible to arrive at valid conclusions. So we look at the validity of that. That's why we say in arguments, we pay attention to only the validity. So systematic investigation would be some where given the kind of premises, there are valid conclusions arrived. So if premises come incorrect or wrong, right, we accordingly the conclusion changes. So science keeps on developing new premises, and you will see that according the conclusion also will keep changing. So those change in the history of science can be read in these lines, right? The systematic investigation means scientific methods in social as well as pure sciences. And pure sciences here would be natural science. So I will hereafter call it social and natural sciences. And valid conclusions. Now, what is social or scientific research, right? As I already explained, so I will not spend any time here. So basically, the idea is developing research projects or social or scientific reality. So you have scientific reality, which deals about the experientiable world, right? The physical, natural world. And the social reality will have its own entities, which are social, coming out of social behavior. So understanding it by using sophisticated critical or reflexive thinking, right? That is reason. And explain it with an awareness and sensitivity towards methodological issues. So the conclusion arrived after offering predictions with demonstrative evidence. So both the sciences, whether it is social or the natural, would require this demonstrative evidences. So the subject of, or you can say the object of this, or the entity of, or the reality which science or social science tries to investigate, it is, as I said, a natural reality, as a naturalist would say, and the social, which is originating out of only the social behavior, right? So it is origination of thought and actions. Now there is a debate. I'm not really taking you too much there, but this distinction of a reality, which is natural, physical, which science investigates, that is natural science investigates, and the other reality, which is socially originated, right? Where the object is basically an interpretation by man, right? It is something which is originating out of a human interaction. That kind of division is now slowly merging. So you will see that there are various philosophers of science who say that this is not acceptable, because lot of scientific reality is not necessarily out there in the reality. So that is questionable. So it is originating out of certain theoretical understanding of the nature, right? So again, it is basically a kind of an interpretation, right, of scientists. So this is how sometimes they put it. Now Anand is drawing another line.
Please, I request our participant, don't do that.
I think I have crossed the limit.
But I...
These are indications. First, there was a green line. Now there is a red one. So there's a way in which our participants are saying, now I should stop. So
or they are getting more creative. They want to create something new out of it.
So I will very quickly, in another maybe 5 to 7 minutes, I will stop.
Yeah, sure, sir. Sure, sir.
Okay. Okay, let me now go to the part which is most relevant here, because that conclusion, if I don't discuss, then things would remain inconclusive, right? Not a problem for philosophers, but other would feel very lost. So let us say, I will just talk about two ways of looking at this scientific progress, right? When I'm saying scientific progress, again, I am not making a significant difference between the natural and the social sciences, right? So these theories of scientific progress, mostly many of you who teach philosophy of science courses would be definitely dealing with this. That is logical positivism, Karl Popper's critical realism, Thomas Kuhn, Lekatos, that program, right, research program, and Paul Feyerabend, right? Paul Feyerabend I was just referring to, who do not make any serious difference between social and natural. I will discuss only the first two very briefly, because I want to say that how philosophy interacts with sciences, right? Now I can say the same in different ways with humanities. It could be with social sciences, but this part is precisely about how certain understanding in philosophy have originated out of its interaction with sciences, right? So whether science got influenced by philosophy or it was philosophy which got influenced by the scientific methods, right? This we can understand. So first one, that is logical positivism, is basically the idea that how modern science influenced the methods in philosophy, right? It's the influence of sciences in philosophy. So you will see that this school, which was typically, developed at certain time of the Second World War. So this idea that some kind of a concrete knowledge is necessary. So they ended up talking about only two kind of knowledge, that is logical knowledge or empirical knowledge. Now, these are the contributors like Schilling, Mach, Russell, Ayer, Carnap. You'll see most of them are mathematicians or physicists. So they're coming from a good grounding in science. Now, what they say, I will only discuss one point from them. They talked about verificationism, right? This is a very popular idea. We all know, in a way. Now, where exactly we got this idea from and what exactly we are trying to verify? And that's what I said, the first two, that is logical positivism and Karl Popper. So they can be talked together on this very concept of verificationism. So verificationism defines their doctrine. So whether confirmation or refutation, right? None can be possible. If that is the case, then science is not concerned about that, right? So wherever confirmation or refutation are not possible, you cannot say science is bothered about it, right? That's the idea. Now, they said even for philosophy, because they are language philosophers, so you can see that very clearly they demarcated the boundaries of philosophy, where verificationism of a similar kind is also used. So observational statements about immediate perception is all we have to limit our inquiry with. So it is meaningful if and only if it can be proved false or true, at least in principle. That means if you cannot assign a truth value to a statement, right? If I say the universe is unlimited, or if I say there is a limit to the universe, in both ways, there is a possibility of putting a truth value. You know it or you don't know. Now, Popper questions this. And Popper in his book, I'm ending this with these two last points. Popper in his book, this Logic of Scientific Discovery, and this another one, I recommend strongly, I think people from all disciplines should make use of it. That is, All Life is Problem Solving. It's basically written at the fag end of his life. And this is a very interesting collection of his talks. All Life is Problem Solving. So it is relevant, again, to not only philosophers, but people who are in political thoughts or in history, because he makes use of those instances very clear, or in sciences. So his proposal is a critical rationalism. And critical rationalism is defined in terms of rejecting verificationism, right? Now, he proposes a principle called falsification. Now, I'm not getting into it, but simple idea is that if you go to an airport, you are being asked to show your iCard. Why? Because they want to verify, right? They want to verify who you are. So is showing your Aadhaar or any legitimate identity card is a verification, or the security guard sitting there or security person is trying to falsify your claim that you are X or Y, right? So if he fails in his falsification attempt, he allows you to enter the airport, right? So Popper is saying the idea of verification is ill-constructed. It is misplaced. And if you look it closely, you will see that it should be falsification. So all the time, what we do is basically to falsify, to refute. And that is the way theories are tested, right? That is the way we test whether what we know is right or not, right? So scientific progress can be made only by falsifying our beliefs, right? So these beliefs are already given by the enterprise of science or social science, or they are already carried in our anatomy, right? So when you open your eyes, you only see certain colors. So that is also kind of a knowledge. So this needs to be always refuted. You need to test it, refute it. Now you will say that what difference it makes to a scientist, right? So Karl Popper is a very good example where a method proposed in philosophy have influenced sciences. And the living example is this man called John Eccles. John Eccles was a Nobel laureate, neurobiologist, and he, in variety of places, he has said, in various places, he has said that Popper's idea of falsification has liberated him from inductive dogma. He persuaded him of the necessity of clear-cut hypothesis, and that falsification of one's own theory is not a shame, because in sciences especially, there are lobbies, right? People, if they propose a theory and any critique of that theory, they would try to keep on defending. But now Popper's falsification is a method that progress can be made in knowledge system only if you join, right, this falsification attempt. So even if you are the propounder of a theory, it is quite fine that you join to be a critic as well. So propounding a theory should also include critiquing it, right? So John Eccles says that it has opened a path to him, right? Because there were a lot of contradictions which were coming in his theory. And he later on, when he started looking at it critically and then building his theory further, then he reached to a certain way of contributing in science. So this is the way you can say, and good understanding of methods in philosophy can influence, scientific investigation as well. So I'm not really taking a side that philosophy only influences other discipline. Their methods are something which others make use of and benefit, but I'm saying this interaction is so meaningful that we cannot really afford to, talk about these disciplines in binaries, right? Thank you so much. I'm sorry, I took almost 20 minutes extra.
Thank you so much, sir, for such a wonderful lecture. In your lecture, you have tried to make us understand the basic structure of philosophy, how philosophy intervene, or how other subjects are interrelated with philosophy, and they connect with each other and they use their methodologies for the fruitful purpose. So this is very important thing which I have learned from you. Also, you have talked about how other disciplines are using, and not just using, but they are connected with philosophy directly or indirectly, whether you are aware of it or not, but it is there. Philosophy is there. We need to understand that and we need to make use of it. So this is what this is very fruitful thing, and this is very important thing you have just presented. Wonderful presentation, sir. Now the floor is open for questions and comments. If anybody has a comment and question, they can ask.
I have bored them enough.
No. People are praising.
Okay, Dhananjay, thank you.
We can have.
Thank you for joining, Dhananjay.
Yes, just a second, sir. Just a second. I'm unmuting. Dhananjay, you can have your question now.
Thank you so much. But just I was alluding to another reference where chaos theory had also origin in philosophy and had impacted quantum mechanics and quantum physics in a big manner. I think that is the reference I would like.
Thank you. That's true. There are a lot of other ways in which this can be said. I just stopped because we begin, the debates in philosophy of science with these logical positivists, because they are the closest, interaction with sciences. And this interaction was basically the modern science at that time really grew in certain way. And we were, having this undue expectation that now we will have a certainty, in what we know, because the kind of a chaos, which was around. So this interaction of modern science with philosophers, it helped us to, draw certain way of doing philosophy. So it's a very interesting way in which analytical philosophy, if you look at, grows from there, because we found a way that philosophy need not to be vague. It can be a certain way, demarcate itself. It can be tool, the way scientific tools are there, we can have tools in philosophy. So it contributed substantially. But then Popper comes up so interestingly that his understanding of the testability, of knowledge, it motivates scientists. So you are right, chaos theory is something which can be again, drawn from this. So this, even the mechanistic idea, the mechanistic idea in science it has also, impressed upon the social science. See, I'm not talked about even the interaction of sciences and social sciences. Natural science and social science again have such a deep interaction that chaos theory, or let us say the mechanistic theory, both have impacted so deeply, let us say, economic theories. Right, the whole idea of economics now, some of the proponents in the recent time, they say it should be basically following the chaos theory. Let there be a chaos and you manage the chaos. That very idea looks very interesting. Rather than having certain set goal and you make the machine so efficient to attain that goal. So that's a mechanistic idea. So they say economy should be run in more like a chaos theory than the mechanistic idea. So that interaction is also there, right? So though definitely they have roots in philosophy.
Now we have another question from Archana. Archana, you can have your question.
Sir, I wanted to just ask because I missed out on your explanation on description and explanation due to network issues. So can you please briefly tell once again, how, in doing philosophy, what are we actually doing? Describing or explaining? Thank you.
Okay. See, I didn't answer this question that what we do in philosophy, because Dhananjay said, no, we don't even just do description. We also have interpretation. There are a lot of philosophers who, advocated for it. So that is not which is my primary quest. My proposal for bringing this distinction between description and explanation was that we should understand that description would not involve anything except putting the facts the way they are, right? So can humans do that? Can we put the facts the way they are? Like, let us say we expect from newspapers and say they should simply describe what happened around us. So if somebody has said something, they should simply put that statement. That is all we want to know, because we have not been around the world all through the day. So description is the role of newspaper. But we know that newspapers do not simply describe. They have certain, ideology which, makes them to give interpretations. So we call it explanation. So if I say why certain newspapers are pro-government, right? You might have heard this term, Godi media, right? So when you say there are certain media houses which are pro-government, now what is this idea? What do you mean by pro-government? So there is an ideology, right, which acts as a ground for putting those facts. So facts may be right, but they put the facts in certain way that the ideology, gives that explanation. So in sciences, the idea of explanation is there are certain facts. So let us say water boils when you heat it. Now, why this water heats, boils at 100 degrees? So if science not providing any law, so we say intermolecular force. So the law which explains the intermolecular force, if used to understand the boiling of water at certain temperature, then you understand why it is. So it's an explanation. So science explains why water boils at 100 degrees. It explains why sky is blue, right? So we can talk about diffraction and reflection. So when you explain the nature of light, use the law of nature of light, then you are able to explain a phenomenon. Right? So explanation would require, apart from the matter of facts, something, either it is ideology in political domain or laws, right, which would make that possible to answer why. So why there is a train accident, why water boils at 100 degrees, why sky is blue, right? These can be explained by, using this. So my question was, can we say that philosophy does any of this job? So is philosophy doing description or explanation? So analytical traditions, if you look at, they restrict the role of philosophy to only descriptive role. They say that description of what? Description of thought, right? So librarian is not somebody who is so knowledgeable. They only arrange the books, right, in the library. So philosophers are arranging the way facts should be arranged. And that gives you a kind of a clarity. So if you're a scientist, you make use of that tool which we are using to arrange. So that's the method. So that's what we are saying, that fundamentally all methods, if you investigate closely, are philosophical, right? So this is where role of philosophy comes. But we are not saying that only scientists can do it, only philosophers can do it. Anybody who undertakes that, arrangement of thoughts is a philosophical task. So history, if gets into the very theories of history, political science gets into the very theory of political science, or let's say management or sciences in that way, they all are doing philosophy, right? So philosophy, if is left to its own work, then it is a descriptive role. But as I said, this is a contentious issue, right? Dhananjay has rightly pointed out, there are a lot of continental thinkers who believe that explanation is a very important role philosophy must play. So whole of metaphysics and philosophy is basically an explanation, right? So when you talk about metaphysical reality, it is explanation, right? So I am not answering your question straight because there is no clear answer to it. There are two or more than two ways to answer.
Thank you, Archana, for your question, and thank you, sir, for your answer. We have another question from Anshuman. Anshuman, I'm unmuting you so that you can ask.
Those who drew this green and red lines, they can also ask.
Am I audible, ma'am?
Yeah.
Yes.
See, I come from the Department of English, so I teach literature, so I might not be very good at philosophical terms, but I was just wondering that, like, for instance, we teach several courses which are kind of interdisciplinary. For instance, we teach science fiction, for instance. So in which we teach a number of things, basically they are imaginative enterprises. And I recently kind of got hold of a kind of interesting article where it was a scientist who was writing it, and he was trying to discuss the kind of terrible effect that contemporary developments in philosophy are having on scientific research. So, for instance, he talked about this theory of the multiverse, which many scientists are actually giving, and which kind of fascinates us in literature also, because we teach science fiction. So we kind of are more more amenable or more receptive to that kind of idea than, let's say, a kind of pure person who practices pure science would be. And therefore, I was just wondering, and this article was a kind of polemic against the kind of science that is being practiced in the Western academia these days, where all kinds of theories abound, which have no empirical justification, which are just exercises in a kind of philosophical method which allows for such imaginings without any empirical proof. And he gave this article a name called The Dangers of Post-Empiricist Science. So when we are talking about, for instance, this kind of constant kind of interrelationship between different disciplines, and how philosophy is at the root of, in terms of its methodology, at the root of most of the other disciplines, scientists have some deep reservations, especially when you refer to logical positivism. I was just thinking that because positivists constantly talk about verification, and even later on, of course, of falsifiability. And of course, they keep on referring to that medieval philosopher who said that, that I don't remember his name, but who said that the existence of God cannot be proved, and therefore the theory of God is not a scientific theory, in a way, because science requires not only verification but also falsification. And since you can't deny or affirm the existence of God, it's not scientific. So I was just thinking that, are you aware of this debate? Or is it simply some kind of a red herring, which is kind of presented in these popular articles? Because we only get to know about science through some of these very popular kind of articles, which perhaps are not published in very respectable scientific journals, to which we might not have even access, and even if we have access, we don't even understand. So it's just a query. It's not perhaps a very question, just an observation. Can you kind of say certain things on it? Yeah, sorry.
Sirola sir, I have very related question, because we also teach philosophy of religion, and we have a paper written by Richard Dawkins in which he says that science discredit religion or something like that. Or I myself has read so many papers in which they always say that the scientific methodologies and scientific inventions and way of doing things are more strong, and they are more valuable than the philosophical methodologies. And you have said that they have interconnection with each other. They are connected with each other. So why people have such kind of perception related to science and philosophy, that science is always downgraded in front of sorry, philosophy is always downgraded in front of sciences. We took lot of each philosophy to our student, that no, philosophy does have importance, it is valuable subject, but we always face. So you can reflect upon this also.
Okay, thank you. See, the first, what was your name? From
Anshuman.
Anshuman. Yeah, Anshuman. Thank you for this question. Anshuman's question is about the post-empiricist science, that if science fails to give primacy to empirical proofs, then where exactly, I mean, what is the difference between science and metaphysics then? Because if somebody says there are monads and this is how the word and reality can be understood, then that is also a kind of a metaphysical system. And post-empiricist science also would, end up there. So I am not aware of this particular writing you have mentioned, but I can understand the thought behind it. See, there are in physics, for example, you have particle physics, and then there are theoretical physics. So you have this empirical, part to physics, and there are theoreticians, right? So these theoreticians do make use of some of the empirical findings which are concretely available. But very importantly, they do not give primacy to those facts because there are very few of them. For example, let us say observation, right? In physics, idea of observation, especially in the quantum mechanics, it has changed significantly, right? Now they say the observer becomes part of the very reality which is being observed. So observation one at a particular space and time one would be different from observation of the same object in a different space and time. So it is not that you can talk about the object, which remains same whenever whoever looks at it. So the idea is, are we talking about a reality which is similarly available to all of us? Now, quantum physics makes a very different, complicated idea about it. So, but at least what we can gather from it is this naive understanding of knowledge of a reality which is out there, and we simply observe it. All of us understand it in a similar fashion. This is not correct. I give you a simple example. So again, from a philosophically well thought, it's a thought experiment. So we say that, how do you know? I see the same colors which you are seeing, which all of us are seeing. Can we have a proof of saying that all of us see red exactly the way it is, right? So if you have a MRI or any brain scan of people done, and you say, okay, if you show them this color, a particular part of the brain shows certain neural activities, is that an empirical proof? Right? So we say, okay, if that is empirical proof, then we say that yes, all brains, normal human brains, act in a similar fashion. But still it is not proving that we finally observe a reality called red in a similar fashion. Because there is no way to check it. The way I see red is also you who's seeing red, or there are differences in it, in shades, or it is entirely different. So we say that epistemologically, we are having a kind of a solipsistic world. We only in some way interact, but we can never prove that my vision of the reality is same as yours, right? So this reference is there, but we do not know it's a matrix or it is something else. But this idea of observation remains subject dependent, observer dependent, right? Quantum physics talks about it now. So post-empiricist science in some way is motivated by this, that since observation and experiences cannot be the sole source of scientific understanding of the nature, so we have to go beyond it. But the fear is that if you go beyond the observations and empirical investigations, then it becomes metaphysics, right? But with whatever limited understanding of science and philosophy, if you ask, I can say, see, if monads and monadic system is a kind of a metaphysical, proposal given by a philosopher, is Darwinian theory a scientific theory? Can we prove that life evolved, originated in the way Darwin talked about it? right? It evolved, right? So we know that millions of years it took, and now humans have evolved out of apes. Before that, Aquarian life and all that. So we have a Darwinian, that tree of evolution, right? So it looks very believable. Scientists do not oppose, and we think is a wide acceptability we have in sciences. But there are again, certain dots which we have created. We have certain proofs, but all those dots are not yet connected because we do not have all empirical evidence to support that. From avians to this amphibian, was there appropriate fossil evidence we have? But we have those dots. Some are provable, others are not. So what we are doing, we are simply accepting it because it is not yet proven wrong. Everything fits well when you look at it from a Darwinian perspective. So some would say, like Popper, it can be a metaphysical proposal again. So Darwinian theory of origination and evolution of life, if we say, is not based on entirely empirical investigations and proofs. Rather, it is a metaphysical proposal in science. Then it is a post-empiricist science, right? That is the way we are saying. But empirical science would say, no, we are still looking for evidences. There are certain gaps, but in coming time, we will fill those gaps, and one day the picture will complete, right? So this is how
actually, that article was actually about, basically, you gave a very appropriate kind of example of Darwinian theory of evolution, because that article actually was talking about a kind of what actually it said. What you said is it makes pretty much sense, but that article was saying almost exactly the opposite. What it was saying was that it assumed that Darwinian theory was what a scientific theory, and probably it was not a post-empiricist theory, as you have pointed out. But what it said was basically that this article was also deeply political, because this is science also doing politics, of course. So the scientists are also political and politically inflected. They also give politically inflected discourses. So what basically he was discussing a certain kind of love of creationism, and intelligence design theory in some of the American campuses, right? So
right.
And therefore
it's
it was
a big debate,
it was saying that basically that how this theories are not at all scientific, and therefore this is actually the result of a kind of post-empiricism, which is now becoming very fashionable in all across American campuses, not exactly on the continent, but on American campuses, and this is a result of what we call Trumpism or whatever. So and therefore he says that the danger of the post-empirical science is basically that creationism can stand at par with the Darwinian theory of evolution. I mean, that's what he was saying.
See, there is an interesting book written by Meera Nanda.
I have read it.
So I found it good. It profits
postmodernism and basically the science.
So see, post-empiricist science, if looked at from a postmodernist perspective, then it is okay. But like this article, the author have a same concern, like what Meera Nanda is saying, that a society where modernism has not seeped deeply into its functioning and orientations, then you are bringing post-empiricist science in the garb of this postmodernist idea, then everything goes. Tribal knowledge is same as scientific knowledge. ID theories, this intelligence design theory is same as the Darwinian proposal. So there is no check and balances. So pseudo-science will seep into sciences. Because right now, the evolutionary understanding, those who hold, most of the biologists, they would say that you can talk about Mendelian theory, right? There are other theories which have certain scientific evidence, but you cannot talk about ID, intelligent design theory as a scientific theory. It is like bringing astronomy and astrology in the same department. Right? This is the fear which they are actually worried about. And this fear is very apt in a society where modernism and modern science has not yet played its full role. But those societies where modernism and modern science have completely got, explode well, then it is important to now understand that it's our native knowledge. There is nothing wrong in that, right? Let us say why we are now in a modern society, civilized society, is more concerned about we should not touch upon this tribal knowledge. No, it is not the bullshit like, we can talk about they are primitive. Now, this idea of somebody being primitive, we are not so carelessly using. So we try to preserve those culture now more carefully. And this is typically because we have explored the limitations of modern science and modernism, right? So we are giving or accommodating, these kind of alternative, sciences. But in the garb of it, it is possible that the pseudoscience will project itself to be science. That is the fear, because ideas
absolutely, sir. But like, for instance, there have been scientists who have been constantly saying that homeopathy is not science, for instance, not medicine actually, or it's merely quackery, or, also because of the reason that we have, as you rightly point out, have become more careful and more sensitive perhaps to other forms of knowledge besides the knowledge coming from, let's say, the Enlightenment and Industrial Revolution. We also, because we ourselves have been dominated by colonialism, and because we sometimes feel that Western knowledge is not the only form of knowledge. It's also a matter of pride sometimes, to assert that kind of pride that we had also certain forms of knowledges which are not considered as knowledge at all, or not considered as science at all by Western world, that we are kind of trying to go into that area. And we therefore sometimes become more prone to accepting pseudoscience perhaps than the Western world would be inclined to do. I mean, this is what I also feel.
Yeah, so this is actually a very fine balance we are trying to strike, but it is difficult because either you slide down to this blindness by the modern sciences, or you will slide down to allowing it. Like Faraban says, anything goes. So that kind of understanding is again dangerous to those who appreciate the scientific, methods. So they believe that there should be some sanctity to the way we understand science and teach sciences, right? That gets lost if you allow everything. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, sir.
Jeronisa's point is that how science is above, or the philosophy when we teach philosophy so seriously, right? The idea, Wittgenstein, you might be remembering, Wittgenstein said science is either above or below the philosophy, but it is not at the same level, right? So the idea is that definitely what he's trying to say is that they are different. So what is above and below? This question is which I am trying to say is incorrect. To say that we in philosophy or in social sciences are always drawing from sciences. Like positivism stands very clearly that we have drawn heavily from modern science. But now if you look at, which we discussed already, that science benefits from the understanding which arises out of this interaction with philosophy. So I think it is necessary to appreciate the very interaction rather than giving primacy to that which is above or below. So this may not be really serving the purpose. That's why I didn't enter into that debate, because science had its role in certain aspect of life. And as I said, that aspect of life has a limitation. But saying that can unravel and give answers to all possibilities, no. You remember in Wittgenstein, again, I quote because I like that so much. He said that if all the questions of science are answered, the problems of life will remain untouched. So basically, he was trying to focus on that the metaphysical issues are core to life. And the other aspects, which are physical and empirically or observable, aspects, they are the only one which science can address. So he was very clear that philosophy should not be mixed up with metaphysics or with science. They are having significant, importance in our understanding. So philosophy has a very, very strict role. It's a technical discipline which plays a very strict role of certain kind in making us to know what understanding is, what is thought, and what is its boundary, right? That's why we have made use of language. But comparing it in terms of the contribution made by science, that is not very apt. So my, I think, focus was entirely that we have to change the goal post actually, rather than evaluating them always in terms of who is above and below.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you very much for your time and your presentation. It was really wonderful presentation, and I can see most of our participants, they have put messages in the chat box, and they are very much mesmerized with your presentation. So thank you so much. Now I would request Nidhi ma'am to deliver a formal vote of thanks. Nidhi ma'am.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Zerunisha. So on behalf of Teaching Learning Center, Ramanujan College, I would like to express my deep gratitude to you, sir, Professor Vikram Sarola, for delivering such a brilliant and thought-provoking lecture on the topic and coming over and sparing your valuable time to deliver this lecture, sir. So I'm sure all the participants were completely enthralled by your session, and we look forward to have a a lifelong association with you in the future as well. Thank you so much, sir. Over to Dr. Zairunisha.
Okay, thank you, Nidhi ma'am. And now I would like to request all our participants and our speaker as well. They can leave the session. They can end the session because we are ending from this side.
Okay, thank you.
And once again, thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, everybody,
and
for
see you. Yeah. And see you tomorrow. See you tomorrow with the same spirit. Thank you, sir. Thank you for joining us.
Bye.
Bye.